All right, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Waste Management Committee meeting. I'm Earl Shepard, the chair for the Waste Management Committee. I have Mr. Cleveland Lattimore and Ms. Jenny Jones here, and I'm not sure who's online, but we welcome anyone that's online. We encourage your participation. We invite everyone to sit at the table if you'd like. The meeting is being recorded, so please be careful with our statements and let's be respectful and decent to one another. We have to keep on agenda, so we like to stick with the program here. There will be a public comment section near the end of the meeting, so we can hear from the public. And anyone wishing to ask questions or make a statement, we ask that you step up to the podium so you may be heard. All CAB members, remember to sign in on the roster. And we currently now in the Waste Management Committee have one recommendation open. It's 321, Improvement Public Communication and Understanding of the Liquid Waste Program and Revisions to the Liquid Waste System Plan. We have the actinide removal process, modular caustic size solvent extraction unit, MCU operating performance update from Brent Gifford from SRR. And with that, we'd like to
people introduce themselves.
Oh, well, before you come up,
You should really do that.
good idea. Again, I'm Earl Shepard with the CAB, and I'm the chair for the Waste Management Committee, and I will pass it on to Ms. Jenny Jones.
Okay, I'm Jenny Jones, CAB.
Marilyn Parsons, CAB.
Cleveland Lattimore to CAB.
Harold Simon, CAB.
Delisa Kirko, I'm the acting federal CAB coordinator.
Jocelyn Anderson, Time Solutions.
James Tanner, Time Solutions.
Thank you.
And in the back.
And anyone in the free audience?
Tom Clements, Savannah Riverside West.
Kim Ridley, DOE. Pat Price, DOE.
Brent Gifford, SRR. Ken Burnfield, Safety Board staff.
Adams, DOE.
Ron Campbell, Public. Adam Waller, DDA.
Nancy Bobbitt, U.S. Senator Johnny Isaacson office.
Josh Garrett, SRNS.
Chrissy Waller, DOE.
Ferguson,
Rose, you are?
Rose Harry.
Thank you all for introducing yourself. So now we will have our committee update. Thank you, sir. Yes.
Would you like to or are you?
Yes, please. I probably need real quick.
Congratulations.
Hi, my name is Brent Gifford. I am with SRR Salt Processing. I have been invited back today and give an update on salt processing and specifically the performance of the next generation solvent in our facilities. I believe the last time that I had spoken with you all, it was about a year ago. And at that point in time, we had implemented a number of equipment improvements, reliability improvements in the process, and we're preparing then to implement a new solvent into the process. So over the past year, we've successfully introduced that solvent and have been running. And I'll cover all that in a minute. So I'm pointing at the right spot. Is that advanced? I'm hitting the right button here. Again, I've already covered the objective here is to give you an update on ARP MCU and the next generation solvent. Moving to slide number 3 in your packet, we'll look at the acronym list, give you a general process overview, and then talk about our life cycle improvements and then our actual performance in FY14 and 15. It's the acronym list. You all are familiar with the Savannah River waste and material flow, and represented on this poster is the ARP MCU process. One of the things, some of the questions the last time we spoke involved, there's some differentiation between ARP MCU and SWPF. And this slide is here to just to represent that differentiation. I'm here to speak about the SRR portion, which is ARP MCU. Slide number 6, the ARP MCU mission is to process salt. And to do that up until SWPF comes online and to mitigate the impact of delay in the SWPF startup. And more recently is to actually deploy and demonstrate the new solvent in the process and continue to provide operational experience for the salt program. Since we implemented this process back and we started up in radiological operations in April of 08, we've continued to look at ways to optimize the process, the flow sheet, the equipment, continue to improve reliability. The key to getting more salt through is really centered around getting a steady feed supply to the process and keeping all of the unit operations up and running together. Again, being that this was a limited life facility, 3-year ops, there wasn't a lot invested in capacitance between the unit ops, and we retrofitted existing facilities to save money as well. Those have served us well, but there are some limitations as you try to increase the throughput and get more and more out of the plants, sometimes into choke points, or if one facility or unit ops is having issues, it dominoes very quickly. So from day one out of the chute, we focused on trying to improve the flow sheet for the first of a kind process, as well as all of our equipment, looking to replace some of our high-risk equipment, and again, goal trying to keep the processes up and running together. In FY14 and FY15, it was a challenging year for us. We had extreme cold weather. Many of you may have experienced that personally. That did impact us at the site, and we had some major impacts, equipment-wise and otherwise, due to the freeze. So it caused us some delays, but nonetheless, we did get the UPS in and began operations in around the December timeframe. And through the fiscal year 14, actually processed about 550,000 gallons. So we were very pleased with the new solvent and with the impacts to process that volume. In general terms, the new solvent shows very good hydraulic and DF performance. Now, DF is the decontamination factor, and that is very simply when you look at the curie content, curie per gallon of the feed material coming in, and then you measure that on the output that's coming out of the MCU. That's your decontamination factor. When we put the initial solvent into MCU, the design basis for a decontamination factor, or cesium removal, was a design basis of 12, a DF of 12. With the old solvent flow sheet, we actually realized in the range of 150 to 250 DF, which we were very pleased with that with the old style solvent. And I'll cover some of the stats from the new solvent here in just a minute. The importance of having good hydraulic performance is that the process is more stable. You have less carryover in the process. So you're protecting your downstream facilities, and you're able to increase your throughput through the plant if it runs more stable. So again, implementing the new solvent then sets the stage to continue to run this plant into the years to come, as well as opportunities to get more throughput through the plant. In FY15, right at the end of the fiscal year, beginning in October, we had a site steam outage. During that time frame, we targeted some additional equipment, again, with the objective of improving the reliability and improving the performance of the process. And then subsequent to that outage, we're back up and operating again. So for FY15, since the printing of this slide, we're now up to around 71,000 gallons we've gotten through the plant operating with NGS. So since we started up in April 08, we're now up to over 4.6 million gallons that we processed through this process. Okay, this is where the rubber meets the road, and this was the question everyone was anxious to talk about, and hence why I'm back here today. This plot that you have in your package shows a plot starting in July of 14 and running through actually into the fiscal year 15 into October 9. And the reason we're showing it from that duration and not since December, we were running a demonstration. In the demonstration, as you're bringing this process online, there's a lot of stops and starts. You run the process for a while, you stop, you pull samples, you run it again, you change parameters, you stop, sample. So very controlled, very disciplined approach to operating the plant. The downside to that is if you're looking at DF, anytime you're starting and stopping the plant, you're bringing all your cold streams up one at a time. So going back to that slide on hydraulic stability, you're not stable. You're not at equilibrium. So there's some mixing that's going on, and your DF is artificially skewed, okay? So starting in July timeframe, that's where we transitioned into continuous operations. We're no longer in a sample and hold. We've released to that phase of our demonstration. And you can see that very quickly, the trend started going up. The down spikes that you see are when we shut down. Okay? So anytime you shut down and you have to bring the process back up, you have to go through, again, getting those streams back to equilibrium, and you have to purge the heels that are out of your process tanks as well. So again, it kind of artificially skews the data. If you took out the low spots, you could see that steady trend. Very, very pleased with. And again, if you compare that to a design basis of 12 originally, 150 DF to 200, 250 with the old solvent, and now we're averaging we were averaging through this demonstration period about 33,000 DF. Okay, we actually had some high spots as high as 38,000 through the demonstration. So very pleased. Now obviously, again, that sets the stage for continued ops into the future. As the SWPF schedule has been delayed, allows us to continue to operate less curies in our state, and also sets the stage again that possibly get more throughput through the plant to continue to work. So that was fairly short and sweet, and I'll just open it up if there's any questions. Yes.
I have a couple of questions. The first question is, what kind of impact specifically does a freeze like we have on this? What materials are impacted and how are they impacted?
Good question. We have operating limits on the process with streams and chemicals. And when temperature gets extremely cold, like it was for an extended period of time, some of our process temperatures were driven below operating limits, so it impacts you that way. We actually had some freeze damage. We had some instrumentation and pumps that were damaged because of the ice.
Is any of the material that's being processed?
No. No, no.
Second question, the DS, you said you're removing cesium, as part of the DF factor?
Yes.
Cesium-137? So, how much cesium-137 is left over after it comes through the processing lines before it hits, ARP-MCU?
You talking
there a
about
large
on the front end of the process
before it hits ARP-MCU?
Okay,
I thought it
your
was
feed
being removed.
material coming out of tank 49, the feed tank, is around 0.2 curie per gallon. That's what we're feeding the process.
0.2.
0.2. Yes. Now, current plans and right now we're processing salt batch 7, and all of the previous, all of the previous batches have been in that range. We're currently prepping salt batch 8, which will take that curie up content on the feed in the neighborhood of 0.7 to 0.8 curies per gallon. That's what we're expecting once we're done making that batch up.
And then finally, the lows on your chart on slide 9. I was curious as to why we have an average of specific segments of performance data. Are these lows going to continue? And will there be a point where you have a projected average? And what is that projected average?
That's a good question. We really, what the demonstration told us is that the longer we run in steady state operations, the better this trend continues. Okay. We don't know if we've hit the threshold. We believe we're at probably the top end of it. We're anxious for continued operations through this fiscal year, really be able to predict an average DF that we can expect out of the plant.
Is there a planned projection?
No.
And that the lows, they're dependent upon the feed, aren't they? So if there's any impact downstream, this is always going to be impacted, isn't it?
Let me go back to the first question. You recognize this is a demonstration. So, from that standpoint, that's why we don't have we had some expectations or what we all believed internally it would do, and it's exceeded that. What we're trying to do is continue to demonstrate to see what does it really do long term, because anytime you're doing testing in the lab, it may or may not identically replicate in the field. And so what does it do long term, varying conditions, varying temperatures, steady state ops, up and down ops. So that's why I answered your question initially. So we don't have a target per se.
I find it interesting that you say that, because very often when we're told that tests have been conducted, there's this opposite argument that the tests are reliable and can predict tens of thousands of years of reliability. But isn't it true that your system isn't totally self-driven, that it's always going to be subject to the downstream performance and throughput? What comes before it?
Right. So there's, let me go back here. Okay. All right, the part that we're talking about that is giving us the cesium-137 DF is the MCU portion of the flow sheet. Okay, and in your packet, right at the very end, you've got a photograph inside the contactor enclosure. Those are centrifugal contactors. There are 18 of them in the process. That's the heart. Yeah, and that's the heart of it. So that's what, with the new solvent, that's what's giving you the DF. To answer your question, what's what other, I believe, if I'm answering it correctly, what are the other impacts upstream or even downstream to the ability to get throughput through the, okay.
What it's fed, you can only process what it's fed.
So when we talk about where are the choke points, early on in the process, one of our choke points was making up salt batches. So I'm going back in time, okay? It would take on average of about 3 months or so, maybe longer, to make up and qualify a salt batch. We now have a separate tank that we do mixing and qualifying in and then move it forward into our tank 49 feed tank. That has significantly reduced that bottleneck and that constraint on our ability and our throughput. We then had constraints on the MST strike time at 96H. Subsequently, we were able to reduce the striking time through process efficiencies and testing, and we reduced that and eliminated that as the bottleneck. The bottleneck that we have now, the main constraint to the process is really getting the feed to MCU. So we can get it qualified and made up. We can get the MST struck added to it, but then you have to move it through another facility which has a cross flow filter and a secondary filter, and it's a 0.1 micron cross flow. That has been the rate limiter for our process. So it's averaging roughly anywhere from 4 to 6 gallons a minute is the averages. So that's our current bottleneck that we're spending a lot of effort to try to improve and eliminate that as a restriction. As far as MCU, the main thing at MCU is just equipment reliability. All the rotating pieces of equipment working together. It has the most working pieces in this flow sheet, with the exception of the receiving facilities like DWPF. So we've made significant progress there. That currently isn't the choke point. The choke point is still getting the feed to it. Because these unit ops are actually different buildings. You got tank 49 that transfers, this is a separate facility, which then transfers to a separate facility, which transfers to a separate facility, which then transfers to 2 other separate facilities.
DWPF.
DWPF, and then to Saltstone via tank 50. Okay, those unit operations are very closely coupled, and you don't have a lot of storage space to hold solution in. So, you know, even in the downstream facilities, because you asked going forward and from the backside, you know, things that could impact processing. You know, if there's an issue at DWPF that shuts them down in their ability to be able to receive strip solution from MCU, we've run out of space very quickly, and so we have to shut down. But
And on the reverse side, if there is some obstructions of flow through there in the in your operation, MCU, ARP, how does that impact DWPF?
oh, okay. Depends on how long we're down. Okay, the primary impact would be at some point on canister production. But we have a fairly large receipt tank, strip effluent receipt tank in DWPF that even though that facility, if they would be down for an outage or for whatever reason, that we can continue to process to them for a limited amount of time. Vice versa, there's a certain amount of material that they can process without having the salt solution mixed in it, because they have that same buffer, you know, roughly 67,000 gallons buffer. So if we would go down, that inventory is available to allow them to keep running.
So they never get to a point where maybe they have to shut the melter down or anything like that.
We never experienced that because of the ARP-MC process. No.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Tom Clemens, member of the public. I had a couple of questions about slide 5. Just to clarify, you've got the arrows between the F tank farm and the H tank farm. I noticed recently that there had been a inner transfer, maybe from F tank farm into F tank farm. does all the liquid have to go from F tank farm into preparation tank in the H tank farm and then on to ARP MCU? How is that actually done? And what's left behind in that process from pumping out of F, and what's the priority with pumping the material out of F or H, stuff like that?
Okay, I'll start by answering the feed for MCU. All comes from the tank 49 process tank, which is in H tank farm. There are various source tanks that are fed in to make up a batch that ultimately end up going into that feed tank. As far as the interconnectability with the F tank farm, I guess, Mark, can you help me?
Tom, Mark Schmidt, SSR. There is one inter-area transfer line.
Right.
It connects F area to H area. So that everything to be cleaned up in F area has to go through that transfer line into H area to the main processing facilities, both MCU and the DWDF. So we would be keeping that line in service until the time F area would be closed down. There is some plan to make F area the priority as far as closing it down, but that's just in the planning stage.
Well, did I see correctly that there was a successful transfer recently? And
That's correct.
What exactly was that material that was transferred?
It was a salt material.
I think we were sending some fees to one of the evaporator systems.
Thank you.
Anything else?
The biggest takeaway from Brent's presentation is that we were asked by the department to demonstrate, to show if next generation solvent was an effective remover of cesium. And without any significant changes to MCU, we were able to introduce that solvent. And he's a little shy to talk specifics on numbers, but you saw them. So we're very pleased with how it performed. And I'd probably confidently say there's 100 times better performance with removal of cesium than what we had with the old solvent. So we'll be sticking with it for the lifetime of this one.
Enough so you don't need SWPF?
No. SWPF has much greater capacity and longevity than MCU was ever built.
I understand, but in case it doesn't come online.
We're not planning for that.
Right, I understand. It's only like 10 years behind now. So,
part of our commitment is to keep MCU up until to the Department of Health and Environmental Control is we'll keep up MCU up and running until such time as SWPF comes up.
don't shut it down.
We're not going to do that.
Right, and one of the slides in there, and that was the purpose that I included the slide on, the continuous life cycle improvements from day one, and we will continue to look for ways to make the plant more reliable, to be able to run it into the out years until SWPF does come online. Recognize the plant was built with the core of it pretty robust. It's concrete, it's stainless steel, it's minimal jointed connections. It's built to that you can maintain it and just replace the rotating equipment and the moving parts. So it can continue to run into the years to come.
Carolyn Parson, CAB. There is a goal in terms of the level of curies that can go to saltstone, right?
That's correct.
So what is that goal? What's the maximum that can be put there?
6 million curies is our goal for the interim salt processing and 0.8 for all salt processing.
So in the saltstone itself, it's 0.8.
Right.
Okay.
Wow. Can hang on to
0.8
it.
million.
I can do
Yeah.
that.
So,
800,000. So
800,000 curie in the entire
saltstone.
So when it's all said and done, that cannot be more than that.
Before SWCF starts up, that's the maximum.
I see, okay, okay. And how is that, I mean, where did that number come from?
That's in the permit.
Right.
Is the permit? Okay,
For salt.
okay, okay, thank you.
And this great performance really makes it, you know, so much more achievable and really, we're really proud of that, yeah.
That's decontamination factor.
Sorry, yes.
Yes. Any other questions?
Yeah, I had one. What do you have in glass waste storage building 1 and 2? Is glass waste storage building number 1 pretty much, I understand that, but is it pretty much all sludge and no,
Yeah, glass waste, this is Jean Ridley, DOE. Glass waste 1, the canisters in there are all sludge only, is the term we use. Glass waste storage building number 2, we started introducing the salt cesium stream into that. Canisters in there do have that. And all future canisters are a combination of sludge and the radionuclides from salt.
so what I've heard then is that the transuranics that we've already sent to WIP, would you agree with this? That if you could reclassify the waste in glass waste storage building number 1 as transuranics, that they would be no more than what we've already sent to WIP.
Yeah, we can't answer that.
I think that would be something really important to find out. If that's true, then I'd recommend, the board recommend that we reclassify those vitrified high-level waste canisters as transuranic. And let's get them to WIP.
Anything else?
I have one.
Yes.
Marilyn Carson, yeah, what is the highest, slide 7, what is the highest risk equipment?
As far as failure,
Yeah,
as far as breaking down.
Yes, well, I mean, that was one of the bullets, it said replace high risk,
Yeah,
I just wondered what that was.
let me
in the process.
explain to you why I put that in there. High risk from a reliability.
Right, I understand that, so what's that in there?
It would be your pumps primarily, then followed secondly by your contactors. You got 18 pieces of equipment, cantilevered rotors, 2 bearings each. So, it's just by probability, those are the things that fail. So,
Was there a pump failure recently?
yes. And
During its lifetime, Brent's probably changed out every pump in that
oh
facility.
yes, at least once. Right.
But that's,
They were not built for long life. They were
So
built for 3 years or less.
that's right. So again, back to the slide on continuous improvements. As we had a hint that we were going to have to operate longer than 3 years, as we were replacing those original pumps, we went and invested in new designs and more pumps. And we've actually designed and purchased those, and on a forward fit basis, as those pumps fail us, then we go in and replace those with an upgraded, more robust pump. That's the stage to continue to operate this thing for years. So that's been our strategy, from
what would
He
be,
also knows the life of the contactors are about 3 years now. So every 3 years, we have it on the books and plan to contact change.
That's right.
So hopefully there will only be one more.
so what's the most, critical, what would be the worst thing that could happen in terms of the process that would really, people would be really concerned with in terms of the operation? Is it the pumps?
If the flow sheet didn't work, okay, that was the biggest concern, which the demonstration has shown that it really works, and very well, better than the old solvent. As far as equipment, from all of our operating experience, there's really not anything in that process that would be, an Achilles heel, if you will. It can all be replaced.
Wonderful, okay. Thank you.
So I have one other question. How much salt have you gotten rid of?
Roughly 4.6 million gallons through ARP.
And that's equivalent,
It started up in April, really.
how many tanks did that come out of?
Ooh,
It comes out of a lot of different tanks.
yeah.
Rule of thumb is for every gallon of salt, you have to add 2
Right, I
gallons.
understand.
So your own 4.6, so you process really a tank and a half,
Tank.
a million and a half gallons of salt.
Have you closed the tank yet? One tank that was salt, that had salt in it?
All of the tanks we've closed so far had sludge fields.
We pull salt from different times, but
Yeah,
no,
salt.
I think your question is oriented.
Some of,
You've not closed,
most of the tanks that we've been dealing with, sludge, salt, and sometimes sludge
Right.
out of that.
but you've not
No
closed
salt
the tank yet
any,
with salt.
no
only.
salt only tanks.
When will you close your first salt only tank? I think that should be recognized as an extraordinary accomplishment once that's done. By the board and the public.
Thank you, Brent.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We're now at our, committee discussion. We have a draft recommendation, double stacking recommendation, recommendation manager is Ms. Benelli. I will not go over the background, but I will cover actual recommendation. It's a joint effort, from Nuclear Materials and the Waste Management Committee. Recommendation number 1, SRS Citizens Advisory Board recommends that the Department of Energy request adequate funding every budget year to safely disposition spent nuclear fuel per the agreed upon the schedule in the federal facility agreement and other legally binding documents. 2, work with Savannah River Remediation and its contractors to request and justify necessary funding to ensure the safe treatment and storage of waste while moving forward with the maximum effort to close the aging tanks no later than the agreed upon schedule in the federal facility agreement and other legally binding documents. 3, continue to research double stacking to ensure that double stacking containers are as safe to the community and environment as traditional stored containers. And lastly, 4, utilize double stacking methods if research concludes that the double stack containers do not pose a threat to the public and environment, to continue dispositioning waste to meet the federal facilities agreement and other legal commitments while the federal repository is sought. CAB members, do we have any? Yes, ma'am.
I think we had taken out number 1.
Oh, number 1.
I think we got feedback that recommendation number 1 focuses more on the nuclear material side
Okay.
and might be better for a different recommendation.
So we're gonna just take that and make it its own.
Rather, because this was going over now as a joint recommendation.
Yes.
And it is, but the feedback was that number 1 doesn't really fit in to the background
You will take that and put it in nuclear material? Okay.
and use it for different recommendation. I think what happened was that adding number 1 was almost like its own separate recommendation again, and it just got too confusing.
That's fine. So if we would just move everything else down then, so it's 2 will become 1. We'll go down. Yes, ma'am, Ms. Rose.
I have a little problem with 3 and the last 4 words, or perhaps the last half of that sentence. We don't exactly know how safe the other containers are. I mean, there's a number of types, for one thing. There's a lot of types of those containers. And we don't know what types we're talking about here. And it has,
It's okay.
It was a pager, it's okay.
I haven't heard one of those since like the 80s, so.
first of all, we don't know what types of containers we're talking about here. And second of all, there are some problems that are coming up with them that have to be addressed. And if you look in the NRC list of problems that they're addressing with various equipment, including this kind.
Mr. Jean.
Rose, to answer your question, I think using the word container in that is incorrect. It's the canister. We're not introducing in double stacking any type of new container. It's the existing stainless steel canisters that we currently put the glass in.
Following up on Rose J. Jones CAB, how about if we just shortened it to continue to research double stacking to ensure the safety of double stacked canisters, period.
Tom, you got a question?
Just clarify, do not confuse spent fuel with glass, right? Glass.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Might be the clarification you need there, Rose.
How's that sound, right?
This is our glass canisters, which are pretty much consistent. We know what's in them, and they're all constructed the same.
But then we should specify that that's what they are. The DWPF canisters.
So do you want to add that word in there?
Focus of number 3 is the double stacking change. That's what we're focused on there. Not on the canisters, but the double stacking.
Those are all
Yeah,
DWPF
but
glass
the language is misleading as it is, so we need to.
So do you think we should continue to research DWPF glass?
Canisters.
DWPF canisters.
Would that make it more concise?
And that's
spell it out.
not hitting the double stacking though.
Just go DWPF canisters. Be done with
Let's
it.
spell it out.
Instead of DWP.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
With
But,
the-
so wait a minute, so what, the way he has it up there is what we're saying, it should say, continue to research double stacking to ensure the safety that double stack
Canisters.
canisters
DWPF canisters.
are
Disposition.
safe.
Yeah, I would
She
change
wants
it to the safety of double stacked DWPF canisters, period.
I think this one came out because when we were at the full board, there were some questions,
Right.
and they were really clear that double stacking isn't going to take away from the safety part of it, that there's really no difference.
My take on that was that it's still in research. They haven't, it's an idea and it's formulated, but they haven't researched all the, I heard one scientist say they weren't sure of the heat factor when you double stack in them.
DOE is still evaluating, the contractor has proposed this to us, and we still have to do our safety review of, as you mentioned, the heat load and the thermal loading of double stacking. But the canisters themselves, there's no change.
Right. Right, exactly.
But in lieu of all of this research that is required to determine whether or not this could be done safely, I have reservations about this committee recommending that they go forward until we have some kind of research.
In number 4, that was what was my problem, is recommending a specific method, the way it's presented there. I would either question number 4 or broaden it to utilize a double stacked or similarly researched method in order, skip down to, in order to continue disposition waste to meet the federal facility agreement.
What is the purpose of the I'm confused now as we're going. What is the, when you started out, what was the overarching purpose of the recommendation? Let's go back.
I wish I'd brought the, the presentation that we got when we were at a full board, but I think the idea was that the first building is full, the second building is almost full. It's 150 billion or million to build a new one, and that's just not going to happen. And so the idea is that in the interim, there needs to be something. And from listening to all the comments around the table, everyone seemed to feel that double stack was probably going to be the one that came out as an interim solution.
Well, I recall recently receiving a response from DOE about a recommendation we had put forward concerning the difference in costs and practices between dry cask storage and a third building or some other option. And the response from DOE was that they'd done a study and that it would save $500 million if we go to the dry cask system, but that currently is under review and being studied. And that's just not double stacking, you know, that's just the single stacking, but it's under study, and that there will be a report in the future. We've asked for that report a couple of times and it's just not ready yet. But so this is kind of the cart before the horse, because they haven't even finished determining whether or not it would be safe to install dry cask sifting.
The dry cask has nothing to do with this. That's for the spindle clip sheet.
And not for this. Not for this.
Rose is correct. There are two related items. Because we need additional storage, DOE pursued an alternative to a glassware storage building through an above-ground storage capacity similar to spent fuel storage. It is dry cask, but it's for the high-level waste canisters. That's a project.
That's the pad storage.
That's the pad storage. And Rose is correct with that. What has happened is that would require, even though it's less expensive than a building, it's still expensive. And it requires line item funding, which is not currently in our forecast for our future budget. So in the interim, SRR came up with, what can we do so we have storage until we have this project online? And they came up with the concept of double stacking. So this is an interim measure until we can get that project.
I think we have that too in the background. Well, Jenny, do you want to do for number 4, start the sentence with consider utilizing?
I would still want to broaden it so that it would be that phrase or similarly researched method. I'm not comfortable with CAD recommending one single method. Consider would be fine. Consider, and again, I like consider the double stacked or similarly researched method in order to continue dispositioning waste, and the rest of it stays the same. If I'm hearing you right, we heard this problem with things filling up and we need storage space, and the purpose of this recommendation is to move in that direction to support the government with number 2, 3, and 4, with a funding, and number 2, number 3, the research objective, and number 4 is, supporting the idea of moving ahead with it.
Supporting double stack.
Or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I don't see anything wrong with that. But I mean, we've come up with a cap. If it's not safe, then obviously they're going to scrap it. But if it is safe, I mean, it was very cost effective, according to.
So you want to just specify the double stack method?
I think it says that already, just consider utilizing the double stack method.
Yeah.
And I think part of the reason for this was that there was some concern that this is such an easy project and so cost efficient that it might get looked over. And I think that's why I kind of wanted to make sure that it was on paper.
Tom, you had a comment? Thank you for patiently waiting.
Tom Clements, member of the public. The language you got in here, on 3 and 4, safe to the community environment and, do not pose a threat to the public environment. I really don't know what that means. I have some mixed feelings about this proposal, but as is always the case with handling these materials, the workers are the ones who are on the front lines. And I have seen one document, and I don't have it with me, sorry, from Savannah River National Lab, which raises some questions, maybe on the heat loading issue rather than a worker exposure issue. But if the workers are going to be handling these containers and moving them, then they have to handle the rest of them. They're the ones that are getting the dose, and there's nothing in here that meets the worker DOE established regulations on worker exposure, something like that.
Okay.
Which is left out if you're talking about the distant community rather than the workers who are at the site. So I would suggest putting in here to address the dose limit for the workers, because if they're changing the distance from the top of the canister, it might have some impact. I don't know if you want to.
I think Tom's raising an interesting question. How much radioactivity is in these salt canisters for exposure to the workers?
And are they using a different upper limit? I mean, the old one was just the one that was set for Yucca Mountain, and it was sort of like a standard across the board limit for all kinds of HLW. And then there was a period when we argued whether or not that was sufficient or not, whether it could be increased or whether it should be decreased. So I'm not comfortable with, until there's some kind of report on what they looked at and what they found.
Well, request from DOE to provide that information to us. Let us know how dangerous these canisters are. You want to know how dangerous the sludge canisters are? You've only got sludge canisters in Class 3 storage building number 1. Those are very cold, relatively speaking. And you want to know what the salt canisters, how much variability there is. So what kind of exposure, Tom's question is a good question. What kind of exposure will the workers experience?
We will take note of that. Jean?
Well, just to comment on that, the double stacking would be done with our current shielded canister transporter. So as far as the movement of the canisters, there would be no additional worker exposure. Where the question comes in is once you double stack them in the building, we have to modify the plug in order to keep the dose rate what it is now, which is very minimal. I mean, it's minimal. You've all been out there and walked around. We keep it, as low as we can. And so we would modify the plugs to prevent any exposure to the workers. But I understand where Tom's coming from. Yes, that has to be included in the double stacking to maintain that worker protection.
Yeah. Ms. Jean, let me sit down. We're not going to basically see any more heat in that particular building structure with the double stacking. That has been determined, correct?
What has been done is SRR has analyzed what the heat loading is in that building and determined whether or not we can double stack based on existing canisters to be moved into there. And the initial report is showing that there is no additional heat loading.
So it's not like you've taken that particular number and then times it by 2. So you're basically, you're not seeing any more than normal.
There is additional heat loading because you have 2 canisters in place of 1, but it's
not that significant.
Right.
Okay.
The heat loading issue is the effects on the concrete.
Okay.
And so that's been analyzed. Again, DOE has not reviewed all of that yet. That's what we still need to do. But in terms of what Bill was saying, these are still relatively low curies from the salt production because this is through ARP MCU. The higher salt canisters are not being considered for this double stack. It's currently just what we've done through ARP MCU.
Can you tell us where those are? We want to know that.
They're in, the ones that have been produced so far are in glass waste number two.
But, I mean, you're gonna have them zoned, so.
In the double stacking process, we have what the thermal loading for the canisters has to be in each slot. So they have looked at that.
So we will look at that, and where practical, we will put the higher dose cans on the bottom.
Right. And that's a good time to suggest that paragraph number 2's got some mistakes in it. You've got the salt waste, which contains low radioactivity. The salt is actually the highest.
Well, that's straight from the Savannah River.
Yeah, but
website.
You should say short life. And higher radioactivity is the sludge waste. That's wrong too. That should be longer life. So it's mostly plutonium 239. I think.
The number of canisters is wrong in the front versus the back.
And then you got a sentence right there in the middle where it says to process sludge.
Are you on paragraph 2?
Still in 2, yeah.
Okay.
So you're not just sending sludge, you're also sending salt. So you might want to, I don't think they send sludge anymore by itself, do they? Send sludge plus salt?
We've mixed in the salt.
Right, because see, the problem with sludge is that they were not filling up the cans. They had a lot of empty space. So they had to produce a god-awful number of cans. So they're now putting in decontaminated salt, which has much lower radioactivity. But it's still short-lived, would be a better way to say that. And the reason why you got to get people confused because, as they just pointed out, there's a lot of very high radioactivity cans that are still out there. That's in glass waste storage building number 2.
Nina, if I can go back to 4, I like your changing to the word consider, and I think I could go with that with the original and just putting consider there. That would be good with me.
I'd like to borrow from Jean's language to indicate that all of this is talking about the lower level.
Whatever you want.
Utilize this recognition for the higher level. And then I also wanted to ask Jean, is in addition to just the overall heat in the building, aren't there geometric spacing requirements?
Yeah, part of being able to double stack it itself, there is height restriction, which is why we have to redesign the plug at the top.
But I'm talking about, for instance, in elevation pools, when you put the assemblies, that you have to maintain a certain geometric spacing pattern, because the proximity of some materials to another could lead to a critical event. What about here?
No. The glass waste storage building number 1 has individual holes. That is our geometric limit right now. The hole's already there. We're not redesigning or changing the configuration of the building.
But double stacking in them, would that change the geometric spacing requirement?
No.
Only.
I think Mark Schmidt's SRR, just baseline on the glass waste storage building. It was designed in the early 1980s, if you will. When it was designed, people did not know that the reactors would be shut down and there would be no new waste generated. So there's been no new hot waste put in waste tanks since the reactors shut down. So what we call green waste, okay? So the material, all the material that's going into the salt waste processing, or the glass waste storage building right now, is much lower heat load and dose than what was ever envisioned in the original design.
What about our foreign?
You're mixing spent
Yeah,
fuel
I know
with
that.
glass
but
canisters. Totally,
still, they are
totally
going
different
into
things.
DWCF.
Maybe.
You've had decisions.
Maybe.
Well, I tell you what,
Sunrise.
it seems that we're pushing and pulling at the same time, so what we will do, we will take all notes of everything that's been said, we'll table this for now, we'll back up and punt again, we'll make some changes, and we'll reissue it. Yes, sir, Mr. Bill?
A couple of suggestions. One of the things that bothers me about background is that there's a comment about the state finding that you guys for, it seems like if you don't clean out the high-level waste tanks, that you're in a terrible situation. And that's true regarding the FFA. But once the tanks have been cleaned out, they don't need to be closed immediately because the risk is gone. So you should be clear about that. It's in the last paragraph. 10,000 a day for failure to close the ranks.
Okay.
It's in a sentence which says that,
Yeah.
that the tanks are the single largest environmental threat, and that's confusing to the average person. That makes sense? Once the tanks have been closed out,
We have language.
even though
Oh, you
they
mean
have
what?
the right to fine the Department of Energy $10,000 a day, once the tanks have been closed out, the risk is gone, pretty much.
Once the liquid is out of them and has been treated.
And it has been cleaned.
Yeah, right.
There's very little risk left in the tank.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd add one other thing too, and I'll leave you my comments. I'd add another recommendation as an alternative. Explore ship-to-whip sludge cans and glass waste storage tank, number one. That should be on the table. Let them consider. If that opens up, we want to be ready.
Okay. You would hand that over to Ms. Nina?
But I do want to say that the language that Nina put in this last paragraph isn't her language. This is.
No, I agree. No, I agree. I'm not disagreeing. And we have taken note of Tom's, about the employee exposure. So we will add that in, and like I said, we will readdress this, at a later date, and it'll be corrected, and it'll be nice for the next time.
Is the joint committee meeting,
Yes.
or not until March or April or whenever?
Do it in
We can do it.
Envisioning
January?
it.
We can do February, yeah.
Or the board meeting
Yes.
In March.
in January?
Is it January?
The board
The next
meeting
is in January. The one after that will be in March.
So do you want me to make
It's
the,
hard to do it in January.
I'll make the changes and then email it to everyone.
During the
That's fine.
combined committee?
Yeah, there you go.
January.
Yes, sir, Ms. Dow.
I have a comment on the question. In reference to Tom's comment, I think that's what comments should be, is it's concise, it's something that you can do something about, and so we can do something with it. And so when you provide the feedback to the board, if you will give it to us in such a language that we can use it, it will be very helpful for the recommendation manager to modify the recommendation after consideration. So sometimes we get things other than being precise, concise language that we can do something with, and it just go by the wayside. So it will be helpful to us when you do provide your recommendation that it is concise. It will help us, and we will appreciate that. Second question, this is my question. Has this recommendation gone for technical review?
Mm-hmm.
And then my question will be, who did the technical review? If all the inaccuracies in the recommendation is still there, who did the technical review?
We sent it to some DOE personnel and they forwarded comments to Nina.
Do you know who that person is?
Yes.
Okay.
I think the main one was taking out number 1 in the recommendation, which we did, and trying to not mix the spent nuclear fuel piece with the storage piece for this recommendation. But the language part from the front, I mostly got from the website, just pulling all the PDFs.
That's already been out there.
Yes.
It's in reports.
That's where I pulled it from. I spent like a good 3 hours Googling this on the DOE website. Believe me, this is not material that I can make up.
And this language, just to jump onto Nina's bandwagon here, is to be readily found in many of the presentations that have been given to this board over the years.
Yes.
So basically what you do, it goes back into committee. You take the recommendations, the feedback that was
Yes.
and then develop it and
Revamp it, and we'll send it back out.
Okay.
It'll be better the next go around. So thank you all for your input, and it's been duly noted, and we will press on. Are there any other committee items that we need to discuss before we go to public comment?
Well, I did want to,
Oh, yes.
could we do the item that's up for public comment? We have time, don't we?
Yes.
Okay. I had asked, Marilyn Parson Cab, I had asked Earl if there were time, there is an item that I wanted to bring up, that wasn't on the agenda, and it deals with, on November 17th, we received a environmental bulletin that talked about an action that is out for public comment. It's called Early Action Statement of Basis Proposed Plan for the Sea Area Operable Unit. And there is, it's out for public comment. There was also a fact sheet that was distributed, and along with a link to the actual document. Since I have been on the board, we've never, as a board and with the public, have had a conversation about what the site should be left like when it's cleaned up to, or cleaning up to a certain level. And that is kind of addressed to some extent in this, what is being put out for public comment. I think it would be a really good opportunity for the CAB to discuss this and to get feedback from the community. Let me just describe sort of what, I mean, here is the 48-page document. I have read it, and when I compared it to the fact sheet, the thing that bothered me some is that what they're suggesting in the sea area, there was a reactor in the sea area, and there were operations obviously involved in that reactor. I mean, there are rail lines, and there are process outfalls, and all kinds of buildings that were used for different processes. So there are some levels of contamination in some of these areas in sea that are talked about here that pose a threat to public health and the environment. And what they are suggesting to do here is to use what are called land use controls. And in this case, the land use controls is fencing and signs. That's basically what will be done to protect, basically they're protecting the public by restricting access to these areas by using fences. The thing that's not mentioned in the fact sheet is that these land use controls need to be in place for 200 years. That's when the risk will continue for 200 years, longer than 200 years in some of the areas. So I think that it would be, I had suggested that we perhaps ask the Department of Energy to extend the comment period so that this body could take a look at this information, have time to discuss it, and come up with, I mean, we can submit comments in a letter, or we could submit we could prepare, if the board desired, prepare a recommendation that would just a cover sheet would go, but that would be the comments. That would be the comments from this body, from the CAB. Well, the comment period ends January 1st. Well, it was a 45-day comment period. Well, it came out on November 17th. That was when the board that's the day of our combined committee meeting. And then the next day we had our board meeting. So there really wasn't time for the CAB to address it. Well, we have the 4 committee meetings this month, but we don't have a board meeting during the comment period because it ends January 1st. So I mean, in the information that goes with this, there is, of course, a process where you can ask for a public hearing or a public meeting. They call it call it 2 different things in here. But there is no information in here how you would ask for an extension of a comment period. I spent 10 years in Washington preparing comments for a group, and I know that you can ask for an extension in a comment period. So I had asked that. I did get information back. I mean, I knew how you ask for a public hearing. You write a letter to Janet. There are 2 people you can write it to. Janet Griffin, I guess, is the one that's with the Department of Energy. So, at any rate, I think it would be worthwhile for the CAB to take a look at this. It's not as complicated as some of these actions that have been out. I mean, it describes, but I mean, the risk to the environment and to the public, I should say, and to workers, of course, is described as a cancer risk. And those risks, I think, are set by EPA because this is a national priority. Savannah Riverside is on a national priority list. And I think there are cancer risks that are set as kind of targets for action. Would that be right, Angela? Aren't there cancer risks that are associated with some of CERCLA and Superfund sites? Is that what is driving the actions of these cancer risks that are stated here?
Angela Adams, DOE. I wouldn't specifically say cancer risk. EPA does set their limits on what a person's doses that a person can get without being affected. They can lead to cancer.
But these risks that are stated in this document are cancer risks, are they not? What other risks are they?
I'm not familiar with that document.
Okay. Well, I mean, for example, I read them as, it talks about an RCOC, which is that's a contaminant of concern. I don't know what that R stands for. For future residents, the risk is 1.9 E times 10 to the minus 5. Aren't those cancer risks that they're talking about here?
I would prefer if we could come and explain, I could have someone come and explain to you what those risks are.
Well, I think that what we would like is to have a public meeting. I mean, I think that's what I would suggest, that we put forward a request for a public meeting so that the risks can be described to the public. I mean, why is there a need for a land use control for those risks?
And for those units in C area, a lot of those were cleaned up or remediated during the Recovery Act period. One of the units in there was the disassembly basin. Well, that water was evaporated. We grouted it such that it will be, we do not have the risk of the water leaking into the groundwater. So there have been actions that have been taken. So that's why there was the land use control that was suggested for that unit for C areas. So there have been actions that have been taken for the remediation. the railroad track. The material was literally taken up and removed and disposed of, and the tracks were left as we put them back into their original configuration, because C area is one of the areas that the department looks at as possibly being maintained for historical preservation. So there have been actions that have been taken to remediate many of those units, and that's why the land use control is suggested for that.
Well, where did they come up with the 200-year risk?
And EPA does come up with those standards.
But to say that you're going to set up effective land use by putting up fences, I mean, fences don't last for 200 years. So I'm not.
They don't, but we, the department, continues. We've had fences up around units, and you go out and you do the control of it. You go out and you make sure the fences are up. You repair them. If signs are down, you repair the signs or replace the signs. So that is something that we, as the department, will continue to do.
For 200 years.
Well, I
they
think,
have to meet a 5-year renewal. Isn't it every 5 years?
Yeah, we do every 5 years. There is a
So the state would have to assure that the control is in place.
so every 5 years, they have to go back and say, is this still protected?
Still working.
I understand that.
But one small part of this that niggles my mind is we're always running into problems for continuing planned projects because there's no funding. So this is obviously an area that would be subject to these problems. If there is no funding to replace fences, what happens?
The remediated unit 68, and we've given presentations on that, and we do the 5-year review to ensure that those remediation practices are still continued. We consider that as safe work for our organization.
Minimum safe.
Minimum safe, thank you. Minimum safe, so those are funded.
They are funded, they have a life cycle funding?
We have life cycle projections.
Well, life cycle projections and life cycle funding.
You're not gonna get the federal government to say, I'm gonna give you $2 in perpetuity. They will tell you that we do our planning, and I think everyone understands we are under an annual budget submission.
Well,
So
we know all of this, but
Yeah.
what I'm saying is that maybe they should just simply clean it up so there's nothing left that you have to build a fence around. Because if it's cleaned up, you know it's gone. If there's something left there and you decide to put a fence around it, but you know that the fence is also subject to the vagaries of congressional allocation, then you can't actually say we have a, fail-safe system here for the public.
And our cleanup standards are not the green field. They're not on the site. Because the site has maintained that they will maintain the periphery of the site into perpetuity. The fences around the site. And within those fences, we will have other fences and use land use control.
well,
There's just a lot of stuff you can't dig up. Like the old radioactive waste burial ground, that's closed. That's officially closed. There's no way that you can dig that up. So, and that waste is going to be there forever. We hope.
in the estimated cost for the project, it estimates that putting these fences, one of the other costs is a deed restriction change for a portion of the land should it be sold at some point in time, as the deed restriction would say that it could never be used for residential. So there is the land use controls are two things, fencing and legally changing the deed for the land. The cost for the project, for the capital cost is $132,000, but the total cost over the 200 years, I guess, is 2.2 million over the time.
For fencing.
I mean, it is I think that it would be worthwhile to have a discussion on how these decisions are made. We can see it in here. They've got the cancer risks. I mean, I read this, and it is complicated mainly because of the acronyms and the way it's written. But I mean, once I got through all of that and sat with a page of acronyms right beside me so I could keep looking back, you can understand it, but it doesn't explain why we're having to do controls based on why these risks, how the risks were determined and why those are targets. Okay, if it would have been a risk of 1 times 10 to the minus 4th, we wouldn't be doing land use controls, I don't think, because that would have been below a risk, a cancer risk level for which there was a target. So, I mean, I think it would be worth hearing it and having this discussion from the public. You know, is this fine? We're going to put a fence and we're going to assume that for 200 years it's going to be there to protect whoever's there. I mean, our country is only 240 years old. This is 8 generations into the future, 8 generations into the future that we're talking about here. I think it's worth having a discussion. If people say, that's fine, maybe it is. That's what I want. That's what I think people should have an opportunity to talk about it and throw out ideas. I think it's worth it to do. So that's why I wanted to bring it up. And if we have time in the next committee, I'll ask again. And then if people think, yeah, I think it might be. I mean, what do you think? You think it's worth having a discussion? Yeah. And if that's the case, I guess, I mean, as chair, I could write a letter and ask for the comment period to be extended and to ask for a public hearing.
I think it's a great idea, and it's a good way for the board and the citizens to learn about what's going on. So I think it's great.
Yes, Ms. Andrews?
And Angela, Adams, COE. Under the FD and SR committee, we will come and present to you the way we make the decisions, what goes into those decisions. This document is one of many that we submit in the 45
over the years, Angela, there's been very little, when you go read this, how many comments have ever been received by the public on these? Not very many. I mean, I think it's safe to say.
And I'm agreeing with you.
Yes.
What I'm saying is, that document is a part of a process.
Yes, we understand
that.
that.
We would like to give you information on not just that document and the units that are there. The process that has been established through the FFA with the EPA and the DHEC on, one, how many documents are done per the waste units that have been identified. We've talked to you about the 515 waste units. Each of the waste units will have documents similar to that we send out for public review. So there's a process element to it. You can, yes, ask for an extension for that document, but we'd like to come out and talk to you about what the process is. And the EPA on setting the limit.
I mean, that's good. I mean, but I think that committee, I've been on that committee, I was on that committee for 4 or 5 years, and we've had many wonderful presentations about the FFA and this process. But here is a document that we have an opportunity to look at and to learn, I think. I mean, yes, that process is a lot of paper. Here is a decision that's been made in the C area. This isn't the biggest thing that's ever going to happen on the site, but maybe it's an opportunity for us as a board and as the public to sit and talk about cleanup. Because how clean does the public want the site to be? This isn't a huge ordeal here, but it's good, I think, to have that conversation.
Write the recommendation, make our presentation.
Yeah.
And they will get
in the work plan, we always, what you're talking about can be put there, because DOE is the one that puts the
comment on that is, I think it'll be worthwhile, yes, review that document, but the decision and the process to get to a document like that, I think would be valuable for the CAB also. Why you choose land use controls over some other remedial actions.
Any other discussion?
So what is the desire?
Oh, let's
To,
go ahead and write it, and then
okay, and
we'll make the
okay.
presentation to DOE, and we'll wait the response, and we'll go from there.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else? We're now at the public comment section. Anybody signed up, or anybody wants to make a public comment?
If y'all can get the vitrified high-level waste away from the site, I'd be happy. That would make me happy. That's my only comment.
Don't worry about that, Bill. We got that covered.
And the site, and DHEC says that, here's another comment you could add to your motion. DHEC says that the greatest threat is in those high-level waste tanks. But once it's removed, the greatest threat is in those vitrified high-level waste cans.
So but I believe they say the liquid when they make that, I believe they say that.
Yeah.
When they,
After that's been removed, the highest threat at the site is in the cans. Would be good to say that so people have an idea of why it's important to get those cans off the site.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Tom's got a comment.
Oh no, Tom's cool. Going once. Going twice. Well, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all for attending, and be safe.
country. So during the interim, she said, well, will you stand in? And I said, sure. And I said, well, you're back. And she said, nah. and continued. So Rose is here, but she's asked me to chair for the meeting. I want to introduce the members of the committee. Rose Hayes is the chair. Nina Spinelli, she'll be back. She went to get something to eat, is vice chair. Louis Chavis, Chris Timbers, Ed Sturkin. And is there anybody online?
Person online, can you please introduce yourself?
Or not? Okay, if we could go to the audience, if y'all could introduce yourself, starting in the front.
Pat McGuire with DOE.
Maxine Maxted, DOE.
Tom Clements, Mayor of the Public, Center Oversight Watch.
Don Gillis, Public.
Dan Burnfield, Safety Board staff.
Ansel Adams, DOE.
Gil Allensworth, Civics.
Tom Rolke, DHEC.
Adam Waller, DHEC.
Dan Hanson, DOE.
Josh Segura, SRS.
Chrissy Waller, DOE.
Okay, welcome. Glad you're here. We do encourage participation. We do have lots of seats at the table. Please feel free to come up to the table, particularly if you want to see the charts better, if you would hear better up here. Please come on up and feel free to sit with us. We do a warning that the meetings are being recorded live, and please state your name and affiliation before speaking. Please speak loudly and clearly. Also be careful of idle chatter, so to speak. The microphones do pick that up. We will be keeping to the agenda topics during the meeting. Also, there is a public comment period at the end where other comments can be heard. If you want to answer questions or address the CAB, we ask that you come up to the podium to speak. This will make sure that the online attendees can hear the comments or questions. There is no public comment sign-up sheet. I would like to go ahead and begin with a presentation for today, and then we'll get into committee recommendations after that. So I'd like Maxine Maxted to come up and give a presentation on L Basin.
And I apologize, I'm fighting a cold.
Aww.
Thank you. I'm Maxine Maxted. I'm the Spent Fuel Program Manager for DOE, and I'm just going to give you an update on where L Basin stands today. And so hopefully this will get you back on track in understanding where we are in L Basin. We're proud of that facility and a lot of its accomplishments this year. It was expanded back in the 90s. We moved from the Roboff facility, which was the receiving basin for off-site fuel, into L area. They didn't actually expand the basin, they expanded the rack space in L Basin so that we could handle the expected foreign fuel and the domestic research reactor fuel that was coming in the future. So that's what L was repurposed for. It's about 3.5 million gallons of water. So it's a lot of water to keep clean and to keep clear. And we're real proud of our water quality. We'll get into the specifics of that in a little bit. We have different depths that we work on, 17 to 50 feet, but typically our fuel is stored around a 30-foot level. And the water, basically the fuel is stored in 10 to 12-foot tubes. I didn't bring my usual show and tell, sorry. We call them L bundles. So the fuel comes it's a MTR fuel, so they range from like 3 to 4 foot in length typically, but we have every size and shape under the sun in L Basin. So we can store about, on average 4, it ranges from 3 to 5 depending on the fuel assembly in an L bundle, and it just helps us with space. The one place that we can do the actual receipts is our transfer bay. So anything that comes into or out of L Basin for wet storage has to go through that transfer bay. So we're learning how to manage that because we're shipping to Canyon now for processing, and we've got to manage the shipments coming in and shipments going out. So it's becoming that's our one roadblock in our facility. So we're trying to manage that so we don't impact other operations. So this is our water purification system. We do not have to cool our water because the fuel comes to us, it's actually shipped dry. So it's been out of the reactor for typically 3 years, sometimes longer, but it's not a melting, the fuel's not going to melt just being in air because it's not that hot.
So the water that we have is really for our workers' protection from radiation. Our water quality, we look at connectivity, pH, alpha levels, tritium levels. We monitor all of that either on some of it's weekly, some of it's daily, some of it's monthly, just to make sure our water quality is staying in a neutral area so that we don't accelerate any corrosion or degradation of the fuel. So by maintaining that water quality, we maintain the status of the fuel as we received it. And if you have any questions, please stop me.
Maxine,
Yes, ma'am.
when the material goes into the basin, based on its character, do you have different geometric spatial requirements from area to area?
Depending on the fuel. Before we receive a fuel, it'll go through an engineering review based on our safety analysis report to ensure that we don't impact our safety analysis. It'll also go through a criticality review to ensure wherever it's stored, it can't cause an inadvertent criticality. So there's, before we receive a fuel, it's usually an 18-month process of the reactor facility providing information on what we call an Appendix A. And that's just our form for all the information that then our guys go and check it against our documented safety analysis report, which is basically a DOE equivalent of a license to operate. And then they also do the criticality, so that's included in that DSA.
But is there more than paperwork involved? Do our guys actually do a hand-on evaluation of what comes in so we know that what they say it is actually what it is?
We actually will send some of our folks to the reactor facility when they're loading so that they can verify what they're seeing on the paper is what they're actually putting into the cast that comes to us. Now, in some cases, they can't do that for everything if it's a large campaign. So in that case, they set up either periodic checkpoints or they set up a shipper-receiver type of agreement where you're going to ship this and it's got to match these identifications exactly, or we stop. And we have stopped. And we've stopped for just a dash in an ID of a fuel number. The paper had a dash, the fuel did not. So they stopped everything until we could get it confirmed that what we had was what was supposed to be on the paper. And it ended up, it was a typo. So, but I mean, our guys are that, it has to be that exact match in order for them to continue to receive that fuel when we get it, if it's not matching the paper. So it's a combination of both that they have to do. We have a sand filter and we have deionizers. And the deionizers are basically just to remove any of the protons and neutrons type things. So our inventory, we work in bundles because it's easier for us to see our capacity limit in bundles, but most reactor facilities work in assemblies. So we've approximately got 18,000 assemblies, probably a little bit higher than that right now. 90% of our fuel is aluminum-based, meaning aluminum-cladded fuel. We do have some stainless and zircon. That's less than 10% of our inventory. It does cause us a problem because that cannot be processed in H Canyon right now. So we have to find another disposition path for that fuel. Most of our fuel is HEU, 75%. We have some that is LEU. It just depends on what the program, the NNSA program is bringing back. And I don't know how they make the decision between HEU and LEU, what comes back. But we have every size and shape. We have pie-shaped fuel. We have round circular fuel. We have the long rod fuel. There's pieces and parts of fuel that we have. We have pins. So we have every size and shape under the sun. And then we also have every size and shape of enrichment plus burn up. So all the conditions, we are not like a commercial reactor. Our stuff runs the gamut. Commercial reactor, they've got one thing that they're wanting to do, and that's get electricity out. So they're optimizing their fuel to that. So most of their fuel is in the same category. Same shape, same burn up, same enrichment. So it's a little bit different for us. We go look at disposition options. We have to look at a bunch of different things. So right now, and just so you can see, this is a bundle that I was talking about earlier. And this shows you the racks, so we call it an L basin. And we have a 4x10 array and we have a 3x10 array that go this way. We're about 90% full in El Basin right now. Then it's all stored in a reinforced concrete facility. The reactors were built back in the 50s. We haven't changed anything, so El Basin was built in the 50s. We had the lab go and look at how long can that facility last. Because the original plans back in the early 2000s was we were going to be out of El Basin in 2019. Well, things have changed. That's no longer the case. So we had the lab go and look at how long can El Basin last. Is it still good? Just to make sure that the basin integrity, the structural concrete is good, and that the fuel is still good. So they did a report, and they came up that it's good for at least an additional 50 years. They think it could go longer. There's some things they want us to do to ensure that that fuel in the concrete is still good. So we're trying to do that. That's our AMCAP, or Augmented Monitoring and Condition Assessment Program. So that activity, that it basically looks at the fuel integrity, looks at the concrete integrity, and the structural integrity of the basin, in addition to what we already normally look for in our water quality. So we have to maintain the water quality along with those other AMCAP activities to ensure that it will last as long as we need it to.
Are you going to talk about in this presentation the current status of the consideration for expanding storage and dry cast systems or other options?
We talk about what our other options are, so we'll talk a little bit about that. This is just to show you the L bundle, and there's just the different types of fuel. So that's the L bundle, a typical of our material test reactor fuel. That's our typical research reactor fuel will be put into the L bundles. It comes in, and they usually have a bunch of extra aluminum on the ends for handling purposes in the reactor facility. When we get that, we take it to what we call our tilt table. And just to maximize our storage space, the aluminum piece has no fuel in it. So we can cut off those ends and get rid of that as low-level waste. And then we just got the actual spent fuel in the L bundle. So it helps us with processing and also storage for us. We already talked about the 90% full. We have about 3,000 bundles, a little bit over. We have what we call an AROD, sorry for the acronym. It's the amended record of decision, and it was approved in March of 2012, no? Or 2013. 13, March 29th, 2013. And it allows us to process up to 1,000 bundles of MTR fuel, which would be those L bundles, and up to 200 hypercores. And this is a hypercore. It's a high flux isotope reactor. It's from the Office of Science at Oak Ridge. And they do a lot of isotope generation there and special studies. But as you can see, it's an inner, whoops, I go the wrong way. It has an inner and an outer core. So it's not like our typical, that's probably about 2 to 3 foot in diameter. So we actually store these separately. They come in and they get separated and they're stored separately. They're in more of a square type of rack versus these tiny little, because that's probably 5 inches in width for the normal L bundle. So they have their own special racks and they're stored separately. But the amended record of decision allows us to process up to 200 cores. We have capacity for 120 cores. We are full. We have no excess space for hypercores. Office of Science has some storage space at Oak Ridge, but they're going to run out. So they need us to process this in order so they can continue on with their operations.
What's the source of the hypercores?
The uranium? Is that what you,
where are they coming in from?
From Oak Ridge, out of Tennessee. And then we have isolation cans. This is our problem fuel. This is fuel we know that's degraded. It has pitting. There's some cuts through to the meat of the fuel. It could have been intentionally cut or it's just damaged fuel. It was overpacked into what we call isolation cans. An isolation can basically has a can inside of it, and it's called an isolation can because this can does not have interaction with the water of the basin. So the fuel inside doesn't have any interaction with the outside water. That's what we call it isolation. It's isolated from the rest of the basin water. And that's just to protect the basin water. So if anything were to happen inside that can, where the fuel degraded more, it would be contained in that can. This is part of our AMCAP program, to go in and evaluate the fuel inside those cans. Now, we've done some UT of the cans, where they've gone down, because it's going to be stored in a square as well. They've gone down on the sides, and they could penetrate through to the inside can. So we found that there was no slumping, there's no stuff that's going to mush at the bottom of the isolation can. So we think that their integrity is pretty good, but we still have to keep checking on that, and we've got to find a way so that we can actually do a visual examination of the material inside. Yes, sorry.
When you go in the can, how do you seal it back up again?
Okay, when we did the UT, we didn't go inside.
What did UT?
I'm sorry, ultrasonic testing. So it's like a radar. So you push it out and it comes back, and where it hits, you get on a film of where the actual material inside the can is, and they know the size of the inside cans, so they were able to take the size versus the picture that they got from ultrasonic testing and see that, yes, they're in the range. So we didn't go inside for that. What we have to do, though, is open those up and go inside. One of the things we have to come up with is a basin isolation system, so kind of like a tank inside a tank, so that we can open those up in a smaller area than the 3.4 million gallons. So if there is degradation, and there's a release of isotopes or crud from that fuel, it's contained in the smaller tank versus the entire tank. So we don't have that developed yet. Back in 2012, when they did this, it was like a $40 million program to come up with that system. So we're trying to find a cheaper, better way to do it. Okay. This shows you our capacity. And this is just for the bundled fuel. We have a separate chart for the hyper because it's stored separately and its capacity is a little different. So the green is showing you the material going out to be processed in each can. The red shows you what is expected in from the foreign research reactors or from the DRR, which is the domestic research reactors. Looking at this. Okay. So this one shows that we had 11 actual bundles go out of the 1,000 in September, I believe, of this year, because we finished the SRE program, and there's a slide on that as well. So of that 1,000, we've done about 11, that was through October. I think we're up to about 26 now, bundles that have been processed. The red dashed line shows you the anticipated capacity or amount, total inventory, and the white line shows you our capacity, which is the 3,650. That's how many bundles we can actually store in El Basin right now today without any changes. So if we can work off our plan and process like we're projected to, we will never have to reach our capacity limit. So if we did not process those 1,000 bundles, we would be up to this 4,100 level if we were to get all the projections that were intended to receive without processing. So you see that pushes us up over the capacity limit. So that was one of the decisions for processing, so that we didn't have to go in and put in new racks. Yes.
Harold Simon, Cab. You said only 11 bundles of the 100 have been processed?
Of the 1,000, but right now I think we're up to 26.
Okay, is that the normal rate of processing, and if not, why is it taking so long?
We had to take a 2-week steam outage in the fall. We take one in the fall and the spring, and it's just to get the plants ready for the changing weather conditions. So 2 weeks of that time period, we weren't operating at all. We weren't processing fuel. We were getting prepared for the steam outage and getting all of our stuff ready for the weather protection for the winter.
Maxine, explain something, please. If we were about to exceed capacity, so we had to get permission to send some of this stuff on over to H Canyon.
Yes, ma'am.
But at the same time, we have talked about the fact that there will be foreign receipts that take up the slots of the stuff that were made available because of the H Canyon process. So how are we going to avoid reaching max capacity with these incoming foreign receipts?
If you look at this red line, dashed lines, that shows you our capacity inventory. So right now, over here, I'm sorry, this number. This is our capacity inventory. So we go over here. This one's better. See, we're right above 350, 3050. And at the end, with all of the receipts coming in, which are the red, we will end up at about this 32. What is that? Probably 3250 of having, would have 3250 bundles in El Basin, but they can store 3650. So we wouldn't reach our capacity limit. Does that make sense?
But what we are presently processing
It's 1,000 bundles.
is 1,000 bundles. So that's what we're expecting to take in.
We have a little bit, we put a little bit of buffer on the 1,000, just to make sure there wasn't stuff out there that the NNSA comes up with that we didn't know about and project. So I think it was a total of 600 bundles we actually have to process to not exceed our capacity limit. So by having the 1,000, we have a little bit of a buffer zone.
And this plan then is encompassing all of the stuff, all the materials that we have agreed to take in over the next few years from the world. It is based on the Atoms for Peace and the NPT material we sent out.
It's based on the projections that NSA has for the global, it's not global, they call it the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Program now. So they do a projection of what's out there and which countries want to participate and which ones don't. Like a couple of years ago, you would have seen OSIRIS material on this graph, and that's from France. They've decided not to send that material to us. So the whole program is based on both the United States being able to take it and the country wanting to get it back.
But is all those foreign receipts, is that research reactor material?
Yes, ma'am.
None of it's commercial?
No, ma'am. We can only take research reactor fuel. We cannot take commercial fuel. It's against the law. Okay, and this just shows you some of the assumptions and what the expected receipts are. This even factors in Japan. Japan kind of had to stop because of the accident. Their port was closed, and I don't think the port's opened yet. So when their port opens back up, they'll start their shipments again. Yes?
This is Dawn Gillis, Public. Are you going to go over what the receipts are expected, like why there's a big blip on 2017?
2017 is the start. We're actually going to start NRU, NRX fuel receipts. That's the Canadian fuel in 15. So part of that blip is in 17 because it's a 4-year, I think it's a 4 or 5 year campaign for NRU, NRX. It's also got a lot of the Australian fuel in 17. So there's that's when we're expecting, and that's what NNSA is working to. There's an issue on the casks that actually move the fuel. The majority of the research reactors use the LWT, the legal weight truck cask. So there's only 8 in the world. So they've got to manage those so that they can get everything in. Because the FRR program ends in 2019, May 12th of 2019. Their NEPA only goes to that date. So they're trying to adjust their schedules to accommodate all those different fuels. But those are the big actors in 17. And I think there may be a little bit of Japan starting in 17 as well.
Maxine, what percentage of that, the FY 15 to 33, what percentage of that is LEU fuel? Do you know? Or
Trying to think. The FRR, I believe it's all AGU. We're expecting a shipment from Germany, Jamaica, and it's either Switzerland or Sweden. I get them confused. It's Basel reactor. Those are the 3 that we're expecting next year, and they're all AGU, from my understanding. They're also included in that would be the NRU, NRX, and that's all AGU as well.
Sure about that?
the ones that we're getting will be. So they are going to send NRX and SATU. So that's a major campaign. I think their LEU is towards the end. It says the hyper capacity. As you can see, the red line shows our capacity. We only have 120 slots. We are currently full, so they can't ship us, and they haven't been shipping to us since 2012. This shows the red is what's going to the canyon, and the blue is what we're receiving in the basin. So we actually have to process before we can receive from Oak Ridge. So that'll show you, and you'll see there were some 0 slots on the other chart, and that's when we're processing hyper. So in 17, we're actually processing hyper in the canyon, not in MTR fuel. So it'll show you we go down, and then there's a projection because the DRR program goes out to 2032, 2035 timeframe. It's different than the FRR program. This is the NRU NRX fuel from Canada. And now it was AECL, now they're called Canadian National Laboratories. So if you hear a new acronym, it's still the same company. They've just done some contract changes. They have, the problem with the NRU NRX fuel is it's about 10 to 12 foot long. We can't handle that in the basin, transfer bay, because the transfer bay is only 17 feet deep. So it doesn't give enough coverage of water to protect our workers. So we have what was called a shielded transfer system, and it's basically the cask will come in. We have a well. The cask goes on top. The basket goes down into the well. Am I doing that? No, sorry, I did that wrong. So we have the well. Cask comes in and gets set into the well. Top gets removed. Then we have this piece that comes over to the top. It's all shielded, and so when this piece gets on top, it can reach in, pull out the basket into the shielded cylinder, and then that cylinder moves back over to a pit that has the water underneath, so then they can lower the basket down into the water and move it out into a deeper area of a basin. In order to do that, with that system that moves, they had to change the grappling system inside. They had to change the weight capacities so they could actually lift it higher and make sure they could handle the weight of the fuel. So those modifications have been designed. NAC International is the one that actually designed the SGS in the first place. So we went out to them to make the changes. They were also the ones working on the basket for the LWT for AECL at the time. So it was made perfect sense to use them because they had all the design criteria and specifications. They are currently fabricating that equipment for us. We expect it any day. It's been delayed, but we expect it any day. And our goal is to have it at least in place in the basin by the end of the calendar year. We won't be ready to use it because we have to go through a whole readiness campaign to show procedures are in place, the operators are trained, the equipment works. So that'll take care. That'll be in the beginning of the calendar year. We were hoping to try and get all that done this year, but we're not going to get the readiness done until next calendar year. Our first receipt is expected in March. We're not sure we'll be ready to unload it in March, but we have a backup plan where it's safe for us to store it until our system is ready.
Will it be stored in the basin?
No, ma'am. It'll be stored in the actual cask. It'll stay in its Type B container. It won't leave the Type B container. We don't expect any other modifications for our typical MTR fuel. Any non-typical MTR fuel is evaluated on a case-by-case basis. For example, we have a slowpoke core that's coming from Jamaica, and slowpoke usually comes in a special cask from Canada, F250. It's got a strange name, but it's just a squatty little cask because they're only about this big. The cask is not available, so they are going to NAC, and NAC is going to put in an application to have a new basket built for the LWT. So that whole process now requires us to change procedures, make sure we can take it as it is. So we will go through that process of evaluating what we need to do to be ready to receive that cask with this special basket inside for the Jamaican fuel.
I'm just so curious. Why would we have loaned out uranium to Jamaica for research purposes?
I can't answer that question. The department, I think they were trying to make it so everybody who wanted it, who had a research need and can prove a research need, was able to get it to prevent a nuclear war, is my understanding. I don't know.
It doesn't make any sense. That was proliferation. You know, I mean.
That was way before my time.
Yeah.
So I understand, though.
That was just escalating proliferation.
So I don't know what the Jamaican research facility does, but they have a slowpoke core. And the slowpoke cores are really pretty tiny. They're about the size of this, and they're pins. But there's a lot of, and I don't know, maybe they were doing medical research in Jamaica for some reason, I don't know. A lot of our fuel is used for medical research. So current approach, we talked about, we're going to continue to wet store. We think that's the safest for our fuel and the most cost effective for the taxpayer at this time. We will process up to 1,000 bundles of MTR fuel and up to 200 hypercores. It's probably going to be about 180 hypercores just because of the time for them to transport it to us and us to process it. It's probably going to be about 180. We're probably not going to get to the 200, but we're going to try.
And that's the Moore Park, California fuel, the Hyper?
The Hyper is from Oak Ridge.
Oh, okay. So which one is the Moore Park, California?
Are you thinking about the SRE fuel, the sodium reactor experiment fuel? That has actually been processed and done.
Oh, it's gone.
It's gone.
Oh, okay.
It's actually waiting to go to a sludge batch and high level waste. It's all been dissolved. It's out of the basin. It's no longer a vulnerable fuel. So that's our next slide, Jim. You want to dive into it? So it was 147 bundles of SRE fuel plus the high aluminum fuel. And the reason we had to do the SRE, which was only 36 bundles of SRE fuel, the other fuel, we needed the aluminum to make the blend so it wouldn't be a peanut butter consistency. It's called thixotropic for when it goes to the tank farms. Because if it got too peanut buttery, you couldn't actually transfer it. So we had to blend down the aluminum, which was aluminum with low uranium. So all of that material was wasted. Nothing was recovered because the sodium reactor experiment fuel had a high, it had thorium, so it had a high U-233, U-232 content, which is too high of a dose for our fuel fab in the United States to be used for commercial generation of electricity. So it didn't meet the specs for the blend down program. We talked about the amended record of decision and the 1,000 bundles. Now we said 15. I've got to get these slides together, sorry. But it's about 26 that we've done to date of the 1,000. And we'll keep a track of that. And you'll see that in your, I guess you call them performance indicators that Rich Olson does. You'll see that over the years. Now, H Canyon is capable of continuing to process the remaining fuel in El Basin, but right now we have no programmatic decision that would allow us to do that. So that's one option we have, is to process all the aluminum-clad fuel through H Canyon and blend it down for use in commercial reactors.
And can you give us an idea of what kind of money we're talking about here? What does it cost per assembly or something to run it over to H Canyon and blend it down again?
We've been working on those numbers since today. The incremental cost above the base operation cost of H Canyon and El Basin is about $20 million a year. It's $18 million for processing. Actually, it's just $18 million because the $20 million included my receipt costs. So it's $18 million a year to process fuel.
But, I mean, if we have 3,000 assemblies in the water.
Yes.
Okay, what cost is involved to take one assembly out and run it over to H Canyon?
I don't have it per assembly or per bundle. We are trying to figure out how to get it in that kind of framework. I can give you campaign costs, but I can't give it to you per assembly. Now, and based on the actual processing rate of H Canyon, it's going to change and fluctuate a little. I think we're currently planning to do about about 100 bundles next year. Based on and that's a limited, Canyon can actually process more than that, but that's all we can afford next year with our funding, is about 10 cash shipments, and I think there's about 10 bundles that go in each cash that gets shipped over. So that would be about 100 bundles that get processed next year.
For $20 million.
Yes.
And so how many bundles?
We have
3,045.
Yes.
Well, I can't do math, but it's a
Um,
lot of money.
The current campaign of the 1,000 bundles is expected to take us through 2022 timeframe, 2023 timeframe. We had a late start, and we had to get the SRE campaign done first. So we were trying to get that all done by 2019, but we've got a late start, so that slipped to 2022 timeframe for the 1,000 bundles. Now, at one time, they were able to, there was a study done, and they could do all the fuel, and correct me because it's in about 10 years.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Pat McGuire with DOE, Maxine just said about 10 years. If we were ultimate goal, we'd like the de-inventory L basin, be able to shut it down. And so one option to achieve that goal is to process the fuel, because we have the capability, the people, the train, the facilities, we have all the waste disposition. We can get that done. And we'd also have to exchange the non-aluminum fuel Maxine talked about with Idaho, and we'd receive some additional fuel. If we were to do all that, such that the ultimate goal to shut down and de-inventory L basin, it would be about 10 years. The processing of that fuel, $18 million a year, over a 10-year period, 180 million, say $200 million, incremental processing on top of what H Canyon nominally costs to keep it a high state of readiness in the public law and all that stuff. Well, that's probably about 80 to 90 million, just to keep the lights on and keep the people there and everything. But also, so that's, again, $200 million additional over maybe a 10-year period. That does not include the cost to do the fuel exchange.
So what's the status of that?
It's still, it's.
Well, there's a slide on that.
So to get your costs, that's what you're kind of looking at. As Maxine said, we don't have it on a per assembly or per bundle cost. We look at more annual. So it's $18 million. As she said, the current record decision would have maybe a 5-year campaign. If we were to extend that to completely de-inventory, it could be up to 10 years or maybe longer. But that also includes the fuel exchange and all that. We'll let Maxine get back to her presentation then.
We've talked about that. So this is on the Idaho fuel swap. The exchange right now is suspended. There was a spent fuel working group meeting where all of the sites that have spent fuel for DOE got together and talked about their current status and what issues we needed to go and address. This was one of the top ones that came up. Idaho would like to do the exchange just as much as we would like to do the exchange. It makes more sense. Idaho already has the dry storage capability out there to store some of their fuel dry. They don't have capability to process aluminum fuel, whereas we have capability to process aluminum fuel. It would also help them meet some of their commitments to the state to get fuel out of their state, and if it could be processed. And it's basically a win-win for the department, because you're moving fuel to places where it can be dispositioned, and it has a disposition path, without having to build an expensive dry storage facility here, which increases our life cycle costs by $1 billion.
And how much of that zirconium cladded is there?
We have 10%. So roughly at 3,000, we have about 300 to 1,000 bundles of the stainless and zirc fuel here. They have aluminum clad fuel that has a lot of uranium in it at Idaho. So part of the swap is that would come here, would get processed through H Canyon. That uranium would then be downblended and used for commercial reactor electricity generation. They would get our fuel, this is zirc and stainless, they would dry store it. So we would never have to build that dry storage facility. They would do it themselves, because they already have the capability.
So why did they decide to stop?
At the time, and this was before my time, but at the time it was a money issue. One side had funding and the other side did not. So one of the suggestions going forward is if they do this, if they decide to do the swap, it needs to be in one site's funding so that both sites are covered, so that the program can move forward and not be stopped again. So we can do that through inter-entity work orders. So if we were to get all the funding for the swap, we would do an IEWO, it's called, to Idaho for their portion of the money, so that we know if Congress were to cut one, they cut it all. It's kind of similar to what we did for processing, because in the past, processing costs were in H Canyon and also in El Basin, because I have to ship it to them. Well, they would cut one and not the other, and so it doesn't help us. So we put all of the processing costs in one of our baseline summary packages, so that if they cut it, it's cut completely, and it's not a matter of someone's got funding and someone doesn't. Because it's not fun to explain why you didn't spend money, and you have to tell Congress because you didn't fund the other piece of it. So before we managed to put it into one.
And Pat McGuire with you, we just building upon that. The department and I think the communities are all about risk reduction. Okay, that's what our ultimate goal is. And so obviously there's risk associated with spent nuclear fuel. But it's very, very small compared to other risks on site, such as the high-level waste. And so while it's kind of a small amount of money to invest in the continued disposition of spent fuel, $18 million a year, you would think, well, we should be able to find $18 million. But if you look globally about risk reduction, when the department has to make these very tough decisions, how much to give high-level waste, how much to give Maxine and spent fuel, how much to give H Canyon, as well as how much to give Hanford to disposition their high-level waste, how much to give WIP, the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, to be able to resume true waste shipping. Overall, the department wants to look at risk reduction. So while we believe we have a very good program and the facilities and the people that disposition this risk is fairly small compared to the other risks, even at Savannah Riverside or Hanford. So we want to make progress. We are making some progress. Maxine talked, we are dissolving fuel. We disposition all the sodium reactors. So we are making progress. Maybe not at the pace where maybe the community would like to see that progress with this particular program. But overall, we're trying to, again, risk reduction. So if we did that Idaho fuel exchange, that would take more money, and is that money best invested in a fuel exchange versus a high-level waste disposition, even here at Savannah Riverside? So when Dave Huizenga was the assistant secretary, he had those tough decisions. Mark Whitney now is facing those, and so we welcome the dialogue from the CAB and other members of the public. We want to continue to disposition the spent nuclear fuel. And $30 million, we'd like to do that fuel exchange. We'd be able to recover that very good uranium and use it for commercial purposes. But looking at a big picture, and I know that that's what the CAB does, look at risk reduction, where is the money best spent? We're making progress, but yes, we could make it a little bit quicker. But the department's trying to make the best decision, and that there are some very difficult decisions.
Maxine, the fuel is coming in from Idaho National Labs. Idaho National Labs is where they sent some material that was at 3 Mile Island. Is part of that coming to SRS?
No, ma'am. The 3 Mile Island stuff is already stored dry. It's under an NRC license. Believe it's, yeah, they have an NRC license on that fuel at Idaho, so that would not be part of the exchange. This would only be aluminum clad fuel.
Okay, and I would like to remind everybody that just because something comes in here and it goes over to H Canyon and it gets processed, it does not leave SRS. We are not cleaning up. We're just moving stuff around.
We've got it in a better...
chairs on the deck of the Titanic.
I agree with you a little bit. We are moving the deck, the chairs, but we're moving it to a much more stable position and form so that it's ready for a repository when that repository is open. So instead of having to send the fuel that's in those L bundles and unpackage those L bundles and dry that fuel and put it into a new container and then ship that to Yucca Mountain, you've now volume reduced all of that had to go to Yucca Mountain, put it into a glass form, which is very stable, and it's ready to go with all of the other glass logs that are out there.
Additionally, the uranium is leaving the site. That is a good thing. So it's just not moving the deck chairs. Some of those deck chairs were given somebody else,
yes,
and that's a useful thing. So, but all this goes to the, and I hate to bring this up, Rose, about the transmutation and partition. Because partitioning is what we're doing. We're taking the uranium out of a spent fuel rod and separating it. We're partitioning it from the bad stuff and reusing it. So we're implementing your partitioning recommendation by doing this. And I don't say we're transmuting because we're not, but as Maxine said, we're reducing the size of that. We're reducing the volume by getting in a more condensed version rather than these, spent fuel assemblies that bad stuff, the fission products and everything, are going to a glass log. So, we're practicing that partitioning, which is more stable.
It's still very dangerous.
Very low risk.
It has the possibility of being very dangerous under certain circumstances. And SRS is a dumping ground. We're taking it in, and there's no place to.
I agree. We don't have a federal repository or final disposition.
So that's the public.
We will continue this discussion.
I have a question.
Oh, yes, we will.
What is the origin of the aluminum clad that's stored at Idaho? Is it both foreign and domestic?
They do receive foreign and domestic fuel. I know that they've received fuel in the past. They had fuel of their own that they have generated as well. So I don't know the total composition of exactly where all of it came from. That would be part of the work that we need to do, is to identify exactly which assemblies they'd like to send us and their characteristics and what we want to send them. That would be part of the work that we have to go and do and set up a schedule for those.
Okay.
We also have to come up with a way to package it so that it can get to them and they can unpackage it, and it can get to us and we can unpackage it. So there's a lot of work that we'd have to do before we could actually start the swap.
Thank you.
We just talked about that. So dry storage. Dry storage is the other option that we have if we don't process the fuel. Dry storage, and just so everybody's on the same wavelength of what dry storage is. It's not just drip dry it. We had to explain that to Dr. Moody. You actually have to go in and set up a vacuum system. You have to vacuum it for so many hours to ensure that all the water's out. The problem with aluminum clad fuel is the aluminum hides water, and the water will then let the hydrogen out either as a gas, which is not a good thing in a closed container, or as a hydride. So we would have to do research in order to determine how long and how fast we could actually dry this material so that we could safely store it in a closed container. Most of the fuel that is aluminum clad that's been dry stored is not stored in a closed container. It's got an open system so that they don't have a pressure buildup issue. Or the hydride, those get released to the atmosphere. So we would have to find out that technology or the research of how fast and how long you'd have to dry the fuel in order to maintain a safe configuration of a closed container of aluminum cladded fuel. So that's part of what came out of our study in 2012 that was done by the lab. It is more expensive for us to do dry storage versus processing. It's actually $1 billion to our life cycle increase to do dry storage just because of the actual equipment. Sorry? It's actually because of the equipment that you have to put in, and then all of the containers that you have to buy and use, and then actual disposal costs of all those containers. Just for comparison, the 1,000 bundles will reduce down to just 35 glass logs. But 1,000 bundles, if you were to send 1,000 bundles to Yucca Mountain versus 35 glass logs, you can see there's a big cost savings in transportation and in the actual disposal volume there. So that's why the dry storage is so much more expensive than just processing the fuel.
But that analysis does not look at the baseline cost of HCAM.
No, sir, it did. Those numbers were based off of a MITRE study that included the base cost.
So if it's $100 million a year, if you're processing for HCAM, that's the 10 years, that's $1 billion, which,
Right, we're talking about $1 billion in savings to life cycle. The actual life cycle cost if we do dry storage is $4 billion. So that's in our life cycle cost study.
Maxine, let me ask a question. I'm just a simple social scientist. However, several decades ago, there were people in the Department of Energy who recommended developing technological methods for transmuting or P&T so that we could simply downgrade this stuff to where it was a very small amount we had to manage. And then people started saying, well, that would take too long and cost too much, but that was a long time ago. And in the meantime, we have spent billions and billions for developing Yucca Mountain, for storing and processing it at places like SRS and INL and ORL. Why do you think we simply have not finally said, okay, let's just go to some heavy research to develop methods for doing what these scientists said, transmuting the stuff the way nature does, but technologically boosting it?
This is just Maxine talking, not the department. I think it's when Yucca Mountain was an option on the table, that was like the third hand is better than two in the bush. If you had Yucca Mountain that was going to open, it was a lot cheaper to put your effort into getting the material ready for Yucca Mountain versus going and trying to find something that's not readily known at the time. That's just me. That's what I would think the decision makers were probably looking at and trying to weigh that the cost benefit of that.
But Yucca Mountain was a crapshoot. They'd never built one before. They weren't sure what all would be involved or how long it would take or how much it would cost. I just keep thinking there was something else at issue. Again, you know, I mean, it was laughing and they called the Screw Nevada bill. So maybe it was all politics.
Let's continue this at the end of the presentation.
We've already talked about the concerns of dry storage. We would have to have a dry storage pad. The report envisioned that being an L area. There was another report after the dry storage report was done that looked at could you do a multi-use pad where you could store the glass logs that are going to be put into the dry storage canisters similar to the fuel, and would that be cost effective? That just got kicked off. They looked at potential sites. It's not sure, based on the little bit of work that they got to do, it's not evident that it's going to be a cost savings because of the transportation, try and get the material from L Basin and from DWPS to a common pad. So there's a report out there, but it's not conclusive yet if that's a cost-effective thing for us to do. Yes.
Our Simon CAB, on the dry storage pad, another report is evaluating the use of a multi-use storage pad. What other?
It would be the glass logs. You know how they're going to go into, if they don't do the double stacking, they've got an option to do storage in like a concrete cask.
Okay.
So it would be using those two as the main drivers. There's probably some material in the area, which is our low-level waste disposal facility. They might could store some of their mixed waste or something there, but that, if it was mixed waste, would require regulatory approval. So the report just talks about options. It didn't really go into a lot of details.
Thank you.
In summary, the fuel, we believe the fuel is safely stored in L Basin and can continue to be safely stored in wet storage. We are using our AMCAP program to confirm that and maintain that. So it's a constant evaluation process. Our water quality is our first indicator that we have an issue with the fuel. So that's one of the things that they're constantly checking for. If there's changes to our water quality, then we know we've got to go look. Knock on wood, we're doing good so far. We are processing some of the fuel in H Canyon and removing that. We did remove the SRE, which we felt was one of the most vulnerable fuels to the basin water. We have looked at alternatives to wet storage. We think they're more costly at this time, but that we do have options on the table if we can't process. And we basically need a direction from the department on which way they want us to go in terms of the remaining fuel after the 1,000 bundles and the 200 hypercores. Any questions?
Maxine,
Yes, sir.
I need to go back, and Tom Clements, member of the public, and look at the MITRE report that you said had a $4 billion life cycle cost for dry storage of the fuel.
The MITRE report has 4 different options, and one of those is the full dry storage, and I believe it was $4 billion. Yes, sir.
Okay,
Presentation.
that's publicly available, right? I know there was a Savannah River National Lab study 2 or 3 years ago.
It was a presentation to OMB that they did, so I'm assuming that would have been a public document. I'm not positive.
Okay, because I mean, I just find that figure rather amazing, because Plant Vogtle just started a commercial dry storage facility. DC Summer, South Carolina Electric and Gas, I think they're going to start loading fuel into their independent spent fuel storage facility May timeframe of next year, and they have a much larger quantity of commercial spent fuel in the pools at those sites versus the 20 plus metric tons here at Savannah River site. I simply cannot imagine.
There's a difference though, because their fuel is all one geometry. We've got stuff that's pi, so I mean you've got to change your drying system so that it can accommodate all those different
I
changes.
understand that, and one of those studies looked at placing a number of the bundles stored in L Basin in one of the, I guess, typical dry cask storage containers for commercial spent fuel. But I don't know what the life cycle cost is for Vogtle or DC Summer, because that's proprietary, information of the company. I can't imagine it's $4 billion. So I regard, without seeing the document or more information being provided, that number is not anywhere near realistic. Hanford has 2,000 metric tons of fuel there. There must be a cost study available on that, because they're going to do dry cask storage. Do you know if there's a cost study on Hanford?
I don't know if that's a cost study. We did use what information that Hanford had on their MCOs. They're using MCOs for that dry storage, and we put that into our report that was done on dry storage. So we tried to use anything that was commercially available, anything that the department already had, to develop the approach that we would use. But because of the diversity that we have and the time frame that it takes to build that, you have to include all those costs for your life cycle. So you're continuing to operate L Basin while you're doing this dry storage. So you're taking a $40 million annual cost, and you're taking it over 30, 40 years as well as all of that.
And just one more question, if I might. At the Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board meeting here about a month ago, it was mentioned that what's it called? Spent Fuel Corporate Board was going to be established.
Yes, sir.
To enable communication between the sites and perhaps other facilities that might have spent fuel or handle it. I don't know if it included naval type handling, naval fuel. But you just mentioned the spent fuel working group. So what has become the fate of that spent fuel corporate board, and what's the difference between the working group and the corporate board that did meet at Idaho the first week in November? And I think you attended it.
I attended by VTC. I wasn't able to travel. It's really no difference. It was just a name change because as it was brought up at the Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board, there was an issue with corporate boards being able to have ability to make decisions and funding changes. The people that are on this spent fuel working group do not have that authority, so it wasn't fair to call it a corporate board, so they decided to call it a working group. So it was a meeting of all the sites, Idaho, Hanford, Savannah River, Oak Ridge, and the Naval Refuels folks from INEL were there as well. And then we had a lot of headquarters participation too.
What was the result of that, if I may ask? As a first meeting?
It was a first meeting. Basically, each site gave a presentation similar to this of what their status is of their spent fuel, and then you were to come up with what are the issues you'd like to see addressed. So each site had their wish list, and then the group at the end came up with 2 or 3 that they wanted to go work on. One of the top ones being the Idaho SRS swap was one of the top ones that came out of that. The minutes, I think, are drafted, but I don't know if they're out for review by the team yet. I know the headquarters is the lead on the whole minutes and keeping all the actions.
And if we want to those minutes, how would we request them? Through y'all? Available?
I can find out. I'll make a note to do that.
You?
We thank you for your presentation and thank you for letting us interrupt with questions.
Oh, no problem.
On the agenda, we had a draft recommendation, but we already did that during the Waste Management Committee, so we're going to pass over that one. And I'm going to go, James, to number 6 with the recommendation. And did you have a slide in front of that as to the definitions of open and closed? Just to kind of review the definitions, the recommendations, the 3 classifications. The pending is that it's been approved by the full board and submitted. However, the response has not been received. Open, the recommendation is changed to open once the response has been received. The board may follow up for further information on a response that they find inadequate. And closed, the action and the recommendation has been completed, selected in full by DOE or open. Right, and we have 3 open recommendations. 307, transferring materials in L Basin to auxiliary tri-death cask storage. 319, planning for disposition of SRS canisters and L Basin materials. And 320, chemical separation of petitioning and transmutation. See, I assume we come back to transmutation. Spent nuclear fuel and defense high-level waste. Okay, slide.
What happens with spell check?
Recommendation 307. DOE response accepted number 1. SRS study indicates cost at over $1 billion. OMB study indicated that processing is $500 million cheaper than dry cask storage due to higher number of canisters requiring disposal and federal repository. Will release report when finalized. Did not accept number 2, needed additional research on drying aluminum cladded fuel, and did not accept number 3, not beneficial to have NAS evaluation without number 2. So pause right there, don't move on yet. I'm wondering if the committee is ready to close this, or we'd like to continue to leave it open. Comments?
Well, I recommend we leave it open until at least the next report.
Okay, that sounds good. All right, let's go on to the next one. On 319, the DOE response was that it was premature to develop a plan for unidentified and undesigned facility. Number 2, DOE EM not responsible for interim final repositories for spent nuclear fuel or high-level waste destined for repository. Will continue to provide to any
nuclear energy
or any future responsible organization information regarding SRS materials destined for the repository. And the next one, DOE EM, is limited what it can do to expedite development of a federal repository. I'll just pause here for a minute. What does the committee want to do, if anything, with this? Leave it open?
None of these issues have been settled, so maybe we either have to write this again later or leave this one open.
Chris, is this one written in 2013 or 2014? So 319.
It was adopted in 2013.
13?
No, 307 was adopted in 13. This was adopted in 14.
14. So it hasn't been a year
Yeah.
yet to leave it open.
What would we be waiting for, though? What action would we?
Well, for one thing, they were going to have to finally decide whether they're going to use Yucca Mountain again, so that would, provide a repository at least.
But what are we asking here? I mean, if we're talking about the repository, And my understanding is that's not something under our purview, is that the right word?
No, but until we know if there's gonna be a repository, there's so many other issues involved. There's gonna have to be design of shipping containers, there has to be, you know, some planning for transportation to, until there is finally a decision on Yucca Mountain, none of this stuff can go forward. All the balls are up in the air.
Can we leave this one open and then maybe halfway through the year, look at closing it and maybe rewriting it with some of the new information that's coming out?
This one, what's the date on this one? It hadn't been.
Go back one, or two, go back two. It was adopted in July of 14.
Okay.
It's only 6 a month.
I like that. Okay.
Just, Pat McCord with you, just a comment or suggestion. In your work plan, you can consider having somebody from NE come down and brief you on what the status of this interim and long-term repository. Maybe in advance you can frame some of the questions that, Rose, you just talked about today. What about pre-planning? What kind of transportation? What kind of design? And maybe pose those in advance to NE so they can come prepared to either answer your questions, and at that time you can decide to, as Nina suggested, rewrite this or maybe close it and rewrite something else. But I think one of the key things is you need some more information. And unfortunately, EM is not responsible for a lot of these areas. And so as you look at your work plan for next year, I think that's a great area that you may want to do, and then pose some questions to NE before they come down. So it'll be a beneficial, it's just not some canned presentation, but will meet your needs as a CAB.
Yeah, it would be great to hear from NE, especially if we're being told all the time that what NE does is not within the purview of this committee.
Yes.
And yet everything we do here to try and ultimately disposition is affected by, you know, the fact that NE has control of the site, the repository.
Agree. And so all we really can do is forward that information, and we do. And the gentleman did come down maybe a year or almost 2 years ago or something like that. And so we can, again, request that someone come down again and brief the board. But I think that'll be a great, as you develop your work plan, something to consider.
And it will be especially important for this committee, I won't be here, but it will be important for this committee to craft the questions that you want him to answer, because last time his presentation was definitely canned. And so if the committee crafts questions ahead of time.
Yeah, the presentation will relate to that. Okay, thank you. Okay, and the next one. Rose, you want to read that?
Repository planning history. This isn't all of it, but I just listed some of the major players. I thought that the CAB has been given various reasons. One that there would be first of all, there would be a Yucca Mountain, which everything in SRS would be dispositioned. Then, of course, Yucca Mountain was taken off the table in 2010. I think. And then SRS, spent nuclear fuel and high-level waste was going to a national repository, but it was no longer specified in terms of where that would be. Then, of course, there was the 2013 DOE strategy that was crafted as on the basis of what the Blue Ribbon Commission recommended. And that was to make a repository available in 2014. Now, where SRS's, they were told that materials were just to be dispositioned, with no other explanation of how that would occur. So far, I still say it's moving the chairs on the deck of the Titanic, because it never leaves the ship. And finally, we were told that talking about the future possible national repository was not within the purview of this committee, and that they would simply pass along our recommendations, which I found strange. And I remember that Dawn had suggested that they expand our purview because everything about dispositioning, about storing, about processing on this site ultimately has to do with its final resting place, which at this point, unfortunately, is not transmutation, but a hole in the ground, variously known as Yucca Mountain or National Repository or whatever. And I'm done.
Oh, no, we got another one. On 320, DOE accepts, number one, the plan is already developed as part of the SRNL programs. Two, it cannot accept DOE-EM not responsible for interim or final repositories for high-level waste and spent nuclear fuel. Information will be provided to responsible organizations.
That would be NA.
DOE-EM cannot require integration requested by CAB in this recommendation. 3 is ditto and 4 is ditto. And I'm thinking we just kind of mentioned that this one's just been passed in July, and let's just keep it open.
Because the Yucca Mountain is just kind of maybe back on the playing field, and we don't know what's going to happen at this point.
Just have a bar with you, just as a comment. Understand the frustration of not having final disposition. Materials still, the glass logs are still staying on site. However, for the most part, the site is not doing anything different because of a lack of a decision. We're still continuing to clean waste from tanks. Okay, so whether, I understand the glass logs aren't going off site, but we're again, focusing on the major risk and the risk reduction at Savannah Riverside. So, understanding the political sensitivity with Yucca Mountain or Federal Repository or other final disposition, the site's still aggressively pursuing the most risk, the largest risk on site, which is the high-level waste, and as well as within nuclear materials, processing nuclear materials, whether Yucca Mountain is there or not. If we run it through H Canyon, we separate, partition the uranium from the fission products. So really, Yucca Mountain or no Yucca Mountain, we're still reducing risk. So we're not dispositioning it, which I understand is a large concern of the CAB to get it to its final resting location. But we are making progress. We are reducing risk. We're encouraging NE to, move forward to get either an interim and then the final repository or final disposition location identified. And that's going to, again, the department said that's going to take a while. And that's why NE, when he or she would come down, 2048 is a long time off.
8.5 presidential campaign.
And things can change a lot. What won't change is that, I will say the safeness, that's probably not even a word, of that glass waste, that glass canister will continue to be very, very, very low risk as it continues to be stored at Savannah River. Much safer than the liquid high-level waste and any spent fuel. While it is safe and very low risk in El Basin, as it moves through and we separate, partition out materials, it again is in a much safer form. So understand, and again, just as a side comment, keep it open. We'll get any down here, and then you can decide what you want to do. But I just wanted to say, big picture, we're making progress. We're reducing risks. And Yucca Mountain, yeah, we'd like to have that decision also, but it's really not changing a whole lot what we're doing here.
Virginia Jones CAB. We appreciate your attention to the safety issue and the continuing to work. Another major concern of the CAB has been safety relevant to the aging facility. So I was quite interested and relieved when Maxine was talking about the new oversight of the concrete was being put into place, because that's at many of the CAB meetings, full board and committee meetings, there's been a high level of concern about the safety of the aging structure. So we're also very grateful that they're continuing to supervise the aging part. Any other comments? Okay, next slide. pending recommendations, and again, some definition needs have not been responded to. We just passed them at the last full board with the L basin cobwebs, potential impact on deep geologic storage, and 325 functional definition of spent and used nuclear fuel. We're a little early.
Back to the CAB, or DOE, I should the cobwebs, and I should have given you an update as well. We have vacuumed all of the cobwebs that were in L Basin, in the 7% of L Basin that they were in. We vacuumed them all up, and they'll continue to do a monitoring program on their normal rounds to see if they do come back in the basin. But right now that we are cobweb free in L Basin.
And again, it's the complement to your detection systems, that you're always there watching for new developments, and that you spotted it, you dealt with it. It's a great thing for SRS.
Maxine, could you explain to us, we had this conversation earlier, but you said that what they found in L Basin is not actually Kenneococcus Colorado.
No.
But it's related. It's the 3,000 bacteria colony.
It is 3,000 diverse bacteria that make up these colonies of what forms the cobwebs. And what's unique about the cobwebs that were found in L Basin is normally bacteria, when they form a strain, stay in a strain. These, when you touch them, they break into little tiny parts, and that's when we went to get the first sample. We used I'm going to explain it as a duster. It wasn't a duster, but like a duster to go into the water and scoop them up. Well, they all broke into little pieces, and you couldn't get a sample. So that's why we had to get stuff. So we had to go to get the vacuum system. In the vacuum system, we were actually able to get a sample, and that's what was sent to off-site labs to confirm that it was 3,000 diverse bacteria that made up what is called the cobwebs. I've been told not to call them cobwebs. They're supposed to be bacterial colony now. But they look like a cobweb. That's why they were termed cobwebs in the beginning.
But they're not related in any way to the other cobwebs that have been found on.
No, they may have some bacterial pieces, or some of the bacteria may be similar, but they don't feed off of the radiation, like the ones that you're mentioning. They don't do that at all.
It's interesting, though, that there have been, that it lives in a radiation field, and that some of it, another form of it, actually lives off of the radiation.
The seeds did not.
What does the seeds live off of?
We could not find the feed source. That was one of the things we looked at in order to eliminate them. You could not find if it was light, if it was a water flow, if it was the actual heat from the fuel. We could not find any feed source that they were using. So that's why we went to the vacuuming approach. Because we knew that had worked and proved that they didn't come back from the sampling efforts.
And were they growing on material that had a common source?
No.
No. And they could have been either domestic or foreign?
Yes.
A mix?
We don't know if it came in with a fuel. We just don't know how they generated, or, we don't know a whole lot about it.
I'm guessing you water sampled too, right? Mm-hmm. Just to make sure you didn't have funky water.
Right. But again, we have 3.4 million gallons of water. Mm-hmm. This was only on the tops of about 7% mm-hmm. of the racks. So it's a very small concentration. They actually did go and water sampled inside some of the bundles, because the bundles have holes in the top to let the water flow. Mm-hmm. They actually pulled samples of water from inside the bundles where the fuel is to see if the cobwebs, the bacterial colonies, were there. And they found none. They didn't find any inside the tubes of the L bundle.
Well, how fast was it growing? Did they determine that?
No, they did. They do an observation. And it's more than one individual, but they go through and they do like a mapping of where the cobwebs were, and they have a scale of 1 to 5 or 0 to 5, and 5 being the most severe. And then based on a common understanding of the severity levels, they go through and they map where they were in the basin. And then they did that, over a 2-year period, and then we actually did the vacuuming this past year.
They never could tell just how fast it was moving.
No.
It'd make a great horror movie.
Our engineer was hoping they could turn stuff to gold, but that wasn't possible. We were hoping for that to solve our funding problem.
Well, we have a little time remaining, so Marilyn wanted to bring up, something for recommendation.
Well, at the, previous, committee meeting, the Waste Management, I brought up an issue, and we don't have new CAB members here, but we do have some new people in the public, so I did want to mention it again. On November 17th, in the Environmental Bulletin from Savannah Riverside, it was announced that there is an early action statement of basis proposed plan for the C area operable unit that is available for public comment. And this particular document talks about that the decision has been made to use what are called land use controls to protect the public from compounds. Some are radioactive, some are organics that pose a health threat if people were exposed under the defined times. And I think they're cancer risks, and I think from what I have read, sounds like that the cancer risks are based on the risk of over 70 years of lifetime exposure. At any rate, I had mentioned in our earlier committee that since I've been associated with the CAB, we've not had a discussion as a board and with the public about what should the final cleanup be of some of these areas on the site. And we feel like this would be a good opportunity to bring that up. The land use controls that are mentioned in this proposed plan include fencing areas off, and those fences would have to be in place for 200 years. That is 8 generations into the future. That is 50 presidential elections or terms. So that's a long time for these controls to be in place. And that is the approved alternative in terms of how you would protect human health, and of course also workers on the site. The other land use control that is mentioned is an area that could potentially sometime in the future, maybe if it were sold to somebody, that it could not support, could not be used for residential use. And to protect the public from that happening, there would be a deed restriction placed in Savannah Riverside. Deed would be changed to reflect that, so that that area, if it were sold, could not be used as residential. Unfortunately, the comment period ends January 1st, and the CAB does not have a board meeting during that time. So I suggested that we ask for an extension of the comment period, and we also think that it would be very productive to ask for a public meeting so that the public can, well, hopefully it would be a way where not just a presentation by DOE, but where the public could ask questions. I don't know what the format, if we ask for the public meeting, what the format will be. I don't know what that, at this point we don't know what that would be. But we thought it would be beneficial to do both of those things. And so we're going to wait until next week. We don't have a mechanism, since we don't have a board meeting, to talk about this as a full body. So I'm taking the opportunity to talk about it at each of them. The other 2 committees will meet next week. And then if they agree that we want to do that, then I, as chair, will write a letter asking to extend the comment period and ask for a public meeting. So if anybody in the public wants to comment on that, I mean, I wanted to bring it up because there are people in the audience that were not here for that meeting. Okay.
I think it's you.
I'm sure.
It's Dawn. Dawn.
I wasn't here, so no, I don't have any comments.
Back row people, any comments? I see you sitting in the back row.
That's why they're sitting in the back row.
I usually sit in the back row, that's why I know.
Well, we do have some people from DHEC, and of course, the action is there are three parties that decide on these actions. Of course, DOE, South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So, it is a tri-agency decision on what these actions were and what the alternative that they decided on.
Okay, thank you for explaining that. Before we do the public comment, I want to remind everybody there's feedback forms on the both tables, and there's a survey online for you. And then go ahead and open the public comment period. And please, if you're making a comment, if you come up to the podium to speak, we'd appreciate it.
Tom Clements, member of the public, also with environmental groups, Savannah Riverside Watch. Just on a couple of points. First, you're going to get into the issue with this comment if it's in your purview, within the CAB's purview, but there are plutonium materials being stored at Savannah Riverside that are outside the scope of the plutonium, disposition program. Namely, some commercial plutonium from, as far as I can determine, from Belgium, Italy, Canada, Sweden, and I think it has a limit of 100 kilos of what might be there. I'm also picking up a little bit from Japan about potential movement of U.S. origin plutonium in Japan, which I think, along with some UK origin plutonium and a little bit of French origin plutonium, that's on the order of 250 kilograms. So I don't know if DOE is considering bringing in that French material or the UK material, which I would object to strongly. The UK material and the French material should go back to those respective countries. But that material is coming in with no disposition path whatsoever. Not that the material at the site now has a disposition path. Given the state of affairs with the MOX program and WIP and whatever's happening there, it's all in a big state of confusion. But I would request that the CAB ask of the Department of Energy, and it might be on the NNSA side and the Office of Defense Nuclear Non-Proliferation, how much plutonium has been brought into the site that is not covered under the U.S. Surplus Plutonium Disposition Program. There is no reason not to reveal what has come into the site and what is planned to come into the site. There's no security reason once it's stored in the K area. From what it looks like to me, it's for PR reasons that they don't want to talk about it, and maybe some embarrassment because there's no disposition path. But I requested the CAB ask for an update on what materials have been brought in. On the second issue I want to raise, which you've heard me talk about a lot before, is the German graphite spin fuel. Since I mentioned it at the CAB meeting on November 17th and or 18th, there have been several demonstrations in Germany to leave some of the spent fuel, the stuff that initially would be brought to Savannah Riverside from the AVR reactor at the Forschungszentrum Jülich site, to leave it at that site. There was a demonstration at the gates of the facility on November 19th. There was a demonstration in Bonn outside the ministry that is one of the decision makers to leave the material in Germany at the Jülich site. And there was also a demonstration in Hamburg to leave it in Germany. At the same time, the state government of North Rhine-Westphalia, where the AVR spent fuel is stored and the THTR spent fuel is stored, about 900,000 graphite balls. The state had commissioned a report which concluded that the THTR reactor is indeed a commercial reactor, and under German law, that material cannot be exported. That report in German, and I've only got it in German, sorry, was delivered to the Bundestag the day before a discussion took, or not, some days before a discussion took place in a committee on November 12th about the disposition of these materials. So I know that discussion took place. I'm not sure exactly what happened after that discussion took place. There are two other reports saying that both of these reactors are commercial reactors, the AVR and THCR, and the fuel can't be exported. So this question still hangs in the air, and it hangs as Secretary Moniz is going to be in Berlin on December 4th, and there may be a discussion group meeting, and this issue is going to come up at that meeting if it in fact is an open discussion to take place, and he's going to be asked some questions if it's allowed at that meeting. But I still think that that spent fuel, which was never a proliferation risk until 2011, the material being considered to be brought here initially, the AVR spent fuel, 300,000 graphite balls. There's some balls mixed in with these large yellow canisters that never had any HEU in it. It was always low enriched uranium. It was told to me when I visited the facility, the balls were all mixed up together. The HEU content 40 years ago, DOE has not updated what the HEU content is today. So the draft environmental assessment is probably due out in January, and Maxine would probably know if that's the case, and there's a 45-day comment period. So, recommendation to the CAB, I encourage you to get involved in that, and if you're not on the CAB at that time, to make comments in response to the draft supplement analysis, for which there would be this comment period. After that, there may be some finding of no significant impact, there may be an environmental impact statement, but that's only part of the discussion. There's a whole political angle that's got to be discussed. And I did file a Freedom of Information request for the non-proliferation impact assessment, which should be prepared on this. I'd requested that. I do not know if it has been prepared or not. We'll find out in response to my FOIA request of a couple of weeks ago if such a document exists. Now, I know headquarters will probably sit on the FOIA, as they're prone to do. Savannah Riverside has a much better record, but the reprocessing technique, as I've said before, on this graphite fuel being developed by Savannah River National Lab may well be the biggest proliferation risk with this whole plan to import this material. So I encourage the CAB to formally get involved in the draft environmental assessment that is due out maybe in a month or so. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Any other comments?
Maxine, I said DOE. We are working on the environmental assessment. I think we've had a bit of a schedule delay. I'm not sure that the draft will be out for public review in January, but I believe it will be out by March. And we'll definitely let the CAB know when that goes out, and there will be another public meeting so that people can bring their comments to that. Now, the EA will not make a decision on the project. It will just evaluate what those impacts are, and it will determine if it's a finding of no significant impact or if we need to go do an environmental impact statement. So it won't be a decision on whether or not the project would go forward. It's the environmental impact that will come out of that EA.
Maxine, my understanding was that there is a project at the Savannah River National Lab to investigate how to separate out the graphite.
We have a work for others agreement that ULIC, Forstrom Centrum ULIC has paid for. So they actually have two. One was for the initial research of how would you go about trying to get the graphite off, and the second one was taking that technology and trying to scale it up into a production mode. We're currently in that second WFO. And our SRNL folks are working on how would they do that technology, and then how do you put it into a production scale, and what would the cost of that be? Because all of that's needed. Originally, it was looked at being about 1,000 pebbles a day would be a production scale to handle all of the material, both ADR and the THTR material. Now, I don't think that we're going to probably end up at 1,000 pebbles a day because they've changed the technology so that they can do it in a different way. But I mean, that was the original onset, was to try to come up with something that would do it 1,000 pebbles a day, because that gives you about a 3-year campaign to remove the graphite.
I'm a little confused over how we can assess the environmental impact if we don't even have yet how we're going to separate.
The EA is looking at it from worst case scenarios of all the options and alternatives out there, so that based on the technology at this approach, what would the impact be? Technology at this approach, what would the impact be? So it's a bounding, conservative approach to what the impact would be. It may not be a specific technology, but it's the technologies that are evaluated will bound what the impact would be.
I'm reminded of Rumsfeld's statement. We do not know what we do not know that we do not know.
Jenny Jones, Camp.
Well, Tom Posey, we do know, though, that the graphite fuel would go into the high-level waste tanks. And if you look at the documents, the presentation, and what they have told the Germans, it is coming to Savannah River Site for disposition. There's no disposition of this material at Savannah River Site. And that was one thing I tried to make clear when I toured Germany. It is not coming to the Savannah River Site for disposition. Disposition of this material is a geologic repository under U.S. law. So there's some misrepresentation, in my opinion, by the Department of Energy, not only to the public, but to German entities. So I attempted to clarify that Savannah River Site is not a disposal site for the German graphite material, whether or not the uranium is removed or the uranium ends up in the tanks. But the question is, why should Savannah River Site be a receiving site for material that was always planned to be disposed of in Germany until they also ran into the same problems with the repository that we're having, didn't know what to do with it. I can't for the life of me understand why this would come here and complicate the high-level waste and tank cleanout program that is moving along, and it will cause additional problems. And the only reason I see that this would happen is that somebody would potentially make a lot of money out of the deal. That's the driver. Plus, the Germans get rid of a problem, but they're only getting rid of part of a problem. The THTR fuel possibly does have HEU in it. It's maybe only the order of under 100 kilograms left. The ADR fuel is very questionable if it has any HEU. So if you're going to go after the HEU, go after the THTR. But the Landtag, the state government said it can't be exported. So I can't for the life of me understand why this is going forward. And I mention those demonstrations because this is going to ramp up in Germany if they're going to move the stuff to Ahaus or to Nordenham to export it. My look inside the facility, and I'm certainly no structural engineer or physicist, those are robust containers that could probably stay where they're stored. I think they said it would be over $100 million to build a new facility. I don't know about the cost, but there's no risk in them leaving those things at the site. Just as I agree with Pat, you can leave those high-level waste fish-fried containers at Savannah River Site with not a lot of risk for a pretty long time. And I think it's the same thing with that graphite spent fuel. So I don't see any reason to bring it over here. And DOE's, as I said before, has got a lot of explaining to do in that draft environmental impact statement of the reasoning behind this and the impact to the high-level waste program at Savannah River Site, which is only going to be negative any way you look at it. So thank you very much.
Is there a comment on the disposition when you get through processing it? What will
There's a couple of alternatives that they're looking at. Even for my voice. But the main concept is to remove the graphite. And when you remove the graphite, you get like a 90% volume reduction. So one of those yellow casks, which is about 6 foot, it's about 8 to 9 foot tall and 6 foot in diameter, I think. And it's a big cask. That goes down to the size of a milk jug of actual kernels of fuel that's left. So you get a huge volume reduction if you do that. Then they're looking at alternatives of how would they process those kernels. And they are looking at alternatives versus H Canyon. H Canyon is one of the options. They're looking at other alternatives of how would you disposition those kernels. And the goal is to not have an impact to the high-level waste system, but to minimize the impact to the high-level waste system and figure out a way to get the uranium out. We are still trying to find a end user for the uranium out there. There's a potential person that's looking at who might be willing to do that. That's a long shot. I personally don't think that's going to come to fruition, but there are people that are looking to try and find a vendor for the uranium that comes out of this graphite fuel.
What's the origin of this,
U.S.
under
origin.
the NBC?
It's U.S. origin uranium.
Why did the Germans put it in graphite ball?
At the time, the graphite reactors were viewed to be the safest reactors because you didn't need water to moderate them, and you could control criticality by one ball versus, you could control the criticality to a very easy, measurable way. So that's why the graphite reactors were looked at. Germans are not the only ones. We have a graphite reactor that we the Fort St. Marine fuel, but it's a different format. It's in hexagonal blocks versus the pebbles. And Japan and China also have graphite reactors.
Thank you. Any other comments? Look. If not, I want to thank everybody for coming. Thank you for your presentation. Nina, thank you. We are adjourned.